Chapter 489. Aina stood amid a pile of corpses, her slender neck tilted. The slight hints of crimson that dripped from her smooth lips shook the soul, her every action mesmerizing to the extreme. It was hard for those who witnessed everything from start to finish to reconcile with what had just happened. In one moment they had been deep within a pit of their own despair. But in the next, the enemies that had had control over their lives were suddenly all dead. When Aina began to battle City Lord White, it became very obvious very quickly that the latter was completely unable to display her true power. Without a choice, the 5 white knights of course forced their way toward their battle, only for them to become lambs to the slaughter. Whatever hopes White City had to win this war were dashed. As the life drained from their city lord, they all became aware that there was no longer a path for them to survive. Aina's body pulsed with an unimaginable amount of power. Her skin flushed with a healthy red hue, a light sigh of satisfaction escaping her lips. Just the sound alone made those who heard it feel their bones go soft. The way it delicately vibrated their ears made them feel as though all their inhibitions were being knocked down one after another. If she told them to jump to their death at this very moment, not a single one of them would hesitate. In the skies, Mordred watched this with a slight frown, doing her best to keep control of her mind. Even she had to admit that she had never been so attracted by a woman before. It was taking all of her will not to bow down and kiss at Aina's feet. Is this the monster? Why is it so different from last time? Mordred, unlike the others, knew that there would be times where Aina lost her rational mind. It wasn't that she became a different person, it was the very same Aina. It was just that in this state she no longer filtered her actions. She did as she pleased when she pleased. Lionel had met this version of Aina just once before during their entry into the Joan Zone. Back then, Aina dove into a sea of Englishmen without regard for anything. It seemed that her stamina had become endless and her power had increased explosively. However, Lionel could see the truth. He saw that she was bordering on fatigue and that her body might collapse at any time. Though Lionel had been curious about what had happened back then, he assumed it had been related to Aina's lineage factor. After all, back then he had sensed that there was something special about Aina's blood as well. As a person who knew little of the dimensional verse, Lionel just assumed that whatever oddities Aina hid in her blood had to be related to her lineage factor. And, since a lineage factor originated from one's family and considering the fact Lionel knew how much Aina hated her own, he never pressed her for more information. However, maybe those things hadn't been so simple as they seemed. Mordred wasn't sure why this time was so different from the last. It could be because of City Lord White's appearance or it could be because Aina had evolved. But, regardless of what the reason was, Mordred was certain of 2 things. The first was that Aina in such a state was absurdly powerful. Though City Lord White seemed to have been suppressed by her presence, she was still a Tier 7 existence. Not only that, but due to her ability being related to blood, her refinement level was far beyond a normal existence at this level. Yet Aina had treated her like a toy. Unfortunately, that still left the second thing Mordred was certain of. The sound of a heartbeat resounded through the battlefield. Aina, who had been standing in an alluring posture in one moment, suddenly regained clarity. Her eyes, which had been an emotionless, abyssal pit, flashed with hints of pain. A heavy air of darkness swirled around her. Before anyone could react, Aina's face burst into a river of foul black blood. The cursed leeches which had not long ago disappeared into her came back in full force and even several times more powerful than before. Aina began to suffer a suppression worse than even what City Lord White had faced. The veins all across her body blackened one after another, her face swelling to the point it became unrecognizable. Her body shrank back to its original size. But this time, whereas the scars had only been across her face before, they descended to her neck, crawling toward her heart. Aina convulsed, her eyes rolling back as she collapsed to the ground. She coughed, more foul black blood leaking from her lips. Aina! Mordred's eyes widened. She dove down from the skies, flashes of worry crossing her visage. Even she couldn't put into words why she was so protective of this little girl. But what she did know was that she couldn't stand seeing anything happen to her. However, in that instant Mordred wasn't the only one who moved. Noah and Jessica had been on the front lines since the very beginning. Though they didn't manage to have as large of an impact as they would have liked, no one could accuse them of not trying. But this wasn't a matter that took any sort of precedence at this moment. Before, Noah was willing to let Aina go for the moment because her strength wasn't something he had to worry about. Unfortunately, it was clear that the situation had changed now. Aina was so powerful that he knew well that if she entered such a state again, he wouldn't stand a chance. In fact, he felt that beneath her presence, he couldn't even bear to lift a finger in an attempt to harm her. Such a feeling left him stifled as a prince. If she was really a member of the Brazinger family, she had to be detained. As for what his grandfather would decide to do after this, it would no longer have anything to do with him. Without hesitation, Noah shot forward. As though by tacit agreement, Jessica didn't lag behind a single step. Chapter 490. You. Mordred's brow shot up. Though she couldn't say that she was surprised by such a change, she was still somewhat caught off guard. Her entire mind had been focused on Aina's condition, so she wasn't particularly worried about what others were thinking at this moment. King Arthur frowned. Hang in there. He spoke to Lancelot quickly. He had been by the knight's side, but it seemed that he wouldn't be able to remain there. Unlike Lionel, it took King Arthur several moments to cast a 3-star mage art. Not only could he not spare the time, but with the condition of his body at the moment, he couldn't spare the stamina to heal Lancelot either. Just the action of moving forward made Arthur feel as though his bones might collapse at any time. In order to protect his men and his wife, he had become the main frontline fighter against City Lord White, and it seemed that it was coming back to bite him now. Noah's expression remained indifferent, his planted legs suddenly growing explosively in size. Bang! His body was like a bolt, crossing the remaining distance in a flash. By the time he landed, his leg had already returned to its original length and he was beside Aina. He reached out a hand, allowing it to grow to the point it could capture Aina completely. At that moment, being so close, he could smell the foul air coming from her. It was as though he had stepped into sewage. The change was simply too different from what she had been just moments ago. Aina couldn't even react to what was happening around her. Violent coughing fits shook her body, a mixture of blood and foul liquids shooting out with every heave. It was difficult to tell if it was just a terrible cough or if she was vomiting. Just as Noah's enlarged hand was about to wrap around Aina, he smelled the scent of danger. But Jessica was to his side. With a simple command, the demonic beasts under Jessica's control shot forward, intercepting Mordred's rain of dark arrows from above. Without suspense, each one was pierced through and died in mere moments. But Jessica didn't even flinch. She had taken control of all of these demonic beasts in the first place so that she could use them as cannon fodder when she needed to. However, that didn't mean that all she had was cannon fodder. Jessica gripped at a set of polished marbles hanging from her hip. At the instant Mordred was slowed, she flicked one of these marbles forward. In one moment it seemed like nothing more than a child's toy. But in the next it grew explosively in size, becoming a massive 4-armed white ape. The ape's roar shook the skies as it soared toward Mordred, intercepting her descent with 4 hammer fists. Jessica didn't want to use her personal beasts until now because she had invested too much into them. Not a single one had an ability worse than the S-grade at birth, and not a single one hadn't been nurtured with all the finest nutrition and environments. However, they were ultimately still infants. It wasn't that they were too weak to participate. In fact, they were the strongest trump cards Jessica had. It was just not worth it in the grand scheme. But now, facing an opponent she was sure wouldn't be a threat to the life of her precious babies, she no longer hesitated. Mordred's eyes widened. This was something she had simply never seen before. But, as a veteran of battle, her reaction speed was still frighteningly quick. Dozens of dark shields appeared before her with a single wave of her palm. This ape had no ability to maneuver in the air. Simply delaying it for a moment already gave her ample time to press off another shadowy platform and change direction, shooting past the ape. But by the time she had, Noah's enlarged hand had already begun to wrap around Aina's body. King Arthur entered the battlefield, his gaze flashing with determination. Aina was the reason Camelot could continue to stand now. He had no intention of allowing her to be taken away just like this. At that moment, streaks of sharp blue tore through the skies. A familiar barrage of ice javelins aimed for Noah's wrists, causing him to frown. His hand quickly shrunk back to its original size, dodging out of the way of the javelins. By this point, Niall and the others had reacted as well. Knowing that their prince and Jessica would be hounded from all sides, they shot forward as well, blocking off the remaining knights of the Round Table. Niall brandished a spear of almost 2.5 meters long, leading the vanguard against Queen Guinevere. He knew well that he didn't have the strength to match up against her alone, but this was precisely why he had brought support. Noah reacted quickly to the change, reaching for Aina once again. But by this point, King Arthur had already closed the remaining distance, brandishing Excalibur against the prince. Noah swung out his massive saber, looking to block Arthur while continuing to reach for Aina's convulsing body. Mordred swung out her wand. A rain of arrows fell once again, pincering Noah from his opposite side. Noah's gaze narrowed. He planned to allow Jessica to protect his back, but at that moment, Arthur's sword met his saber. A deep, reverberating clash of blades shook the battlefield as Noah was forced to retreat several steps. Noah stumbled out of range of Aina, only to be assaulted by a rain of arrows to his back. Jessica reacted quickly, her whip lashing out several times in quick succession. In the blink of an eye, the battlefield split into three. The knights and Guinevere against a team led by Niall. Noah against Arthur. And finally, Jessica faced Mordred. They stood in a triangle around Aina's convulsing body, the pressure growing palpably. Chapter 491. Jessica's four-armed ape fell heavily to the ground, causing the battlefield to quake. As though it was a cue, the stalemate broke. A barrage of attacks descended from all sides. If one was looking from afar, it would be hard to imagine that such a commotion was being caused for the sake of one young girl who had long since lost the ability to move. Aina's situation only seemed to grow worse by the moment. Whereas before the foul black blood only shot from her mouth when she coughed, now even when she was only gasping for breath, it blocked her airways, causing her to subconsciously grasp at her throat even in her unconscious state. The grotesque scars traveled down her neck, swallowing it in swelling that made one's heart churn. It felt like the curse was venting its hatred for having been humiliated, lashing out with a fervor it never had before. Aina's current mind was in turmoil. All she could feel was pain. Her every heartbeat felt as though the walls of her chest were pressing against a cage. It took so much effort just to circulate her blood once around her body, and with every passing moment, it only seemed to become more difficult. As though this wasn't bad enough, the blood she was circulating seemed contaminated. It ate away at her flesh, devouring her bones and dug into her soul. It seemed that it wouldn't be satisfied until it took away everything she had left. Aina was completely unaware of her surroundings, completely unaware that so many were fighting for and against her sake. All she knew was pain and darkness. It was the kind of pain that made one rather end it all than suffer for another second. Noah and King Arthur clashed once again, their blades bending and whining beneath their strength. Despite Noah's increased size, Arthur didn't back down for even a moment. It had been too long since the king had met an opponent he could go all out against. He had reached the limits of Camelot a long time ago, so long ago in fact, that many had already forgotten that he was a genius of battle. The longer he fought against Noah, the faster and swifter he seemed to become. However, Noah responded in kind. Every improvement Arthur made, Noah seemed to match, whether it be in talent or him having held back from the very beginning. The truth was that Noah knew that Arthur was the key to taking Camelot under their wing with ease. If he died, then everything would become far more difficult. It would be much easier if they could subdue this king without killing him, that would be for the best. But, at the same time, compared to the threat Aina posed, Camelot was worth far less. At least, that was what Noah thought until he began to fight Arthur in earnest. Looks like I have to get serious, Noah thought. In that moment, Noah's body shrunk down explosively, dodging out of the way of Arthur's last strike. The density of Noah's skin and bone shot up. It began to reflect like diamond beneath the high sun rays. With a hard step forward, Noah's steps shook the earth with more force than even Jessica's ape. Arthur's eyes sharpened. With his experience in battle, he didn't need to guess to know that he couldn't take this strike head-on. It was simply too heavy. It wouldn't be a surprise if he ended up just as injured as Lancelot if he tried to. They held back all this time. Arthur was pissed, but there was nothing he could do about it. If he was being real with himself, he too held back. How could he not? How could they possibly fight wholeheartedly by the side of an army they thought was another potential enemy? The issue was that it was clear that Noah and Jessica had held back far more than Arthur and his men had. Jessica flicked out several more marbles in Mordred's direction, each morphing into a large predator beast. A large king of serpents, a snow-white falcon, a silver lion, and finally a butterfly with a wingspan of over a meter. The pressure that was suddenly applied to both Arthur and his daughter multiplied several times over. At the same time, the number of enemies Guinevere needed to face rose. There was simply no one of Camelot outside a few knights and mages that were worthy of fighting in a battle of this quality. Though Earth had poor foundations, Camelot had even weaker foundations. It had to be remembered that they were born of tales passed down by humans of Earth. In those tales, the main focus were just a few characters. As a result, the majority of Camelot's strength was likewise concentrated into these characters. Now, Camelot was beginning to break free of the constraints of those stories. But that left them in a state similar to when Earth's metamorphosis first descended. In fact, even to now, Arthur didn't dare to use his ability in battle because he didn't quite trust it. After decades of battle and honing his skill, how could Arthur suddenly change his battle tactics and instincts on a dime? In fact, the same went for the other knights and mages as well. This mental handicap left them subconsciously hampering themselves. The worst part was that even if they got over this mental roadblock, how could they possibly face an army of 1,000 talents who had been honing their battle techniques for over a year now? Mordred's jaw clenched, her wrist flicking as she sent out spell after spell. She felt as though the stamina she needed to cast mage arts had dropped by more than tenfold. In fact, the time she needed also fell drastically. With such improvement, she didn't believe that she couldn't protect Aina. She didn't believe that she wouldn't be able to stop these people that stood before her. Her power had always been something that caused her to be ostracized. But today she would allow it to display its true might. Unfortunately, as much as Mordred wanted to believe this, in her heart of hearts, her soul of souls, the gap was simply too wide. Chapter 492. Noah's blade became heavy and light at his command. The variations in his attacks reached a new level. To swing a two-handed blade like it was nothing more than a feather, but for it to still carry the heaviness of a blunt weapon. This was Noah's fighting style. Arthur was continuously pushed to his back foot. Despite the fact Arthur was in the fourth dimension while Noah was not just yet, Noah was able to use his ability that had already entered the fifth dimension to suppress the king with ease. This was the benefit of an offensive ability. Unlike Lionel, who had trouble bridging this gap with just his own strength, Noah had no issue doing this. This was the power of a true variant, this was the strength of talent. Unfortunately, Noah's abilities were even beyond just this. While he could use them offensively, he could use them for evasion and defense just as easily. When all of these were fused into one, Arthur could hardly find a single span to breathe, let alone counterattack. Arthur's jaw remained locked. He relied on his white lion armor to withstand much of the pressure his body couldn't. He coated his body in the light element using light body to give himself a small boost in speed and attacking quickness. Noah's saber swung down from above. The instant before it made contact with Arthur, Noah increased its density and weight by more than tenfold. Arthur's knees bent beneath the pressure, his two hands gripping his sword with all his might. If it wasn't for the fact Excalibur was a quasi-bronze treasure on the brink of becoming a true bronze treasure, it would be a wonder if it survived for so long. "Give up," Noah said coldly. By now, Noah's mind had calmed considerably. Having had time to observe Aina's state, it really seemed like she might die at any moment. Though he didn't know what was wrong with her, it, at the very least, seemed that she wouldn't be able to use such strength in the meanwhile. Noah was content to watch Aina slowly die in this fashion. As such, his battle had become less about quickly capturing her, and more about displaying the might of the Empire, all while not allowing anyone to help Aina. If she could die, that would be the best. If not, he would settle for her being crippled. Regardless of what truly happened, there would be a greater chance of his ideal outcome occurring as long as he continued to stall. Across the battlefield, Mordred and Guinevere were dealing with the same issue. Since even they, as the weaker party, had been able to stop Noah and Jessica from capturing Aina, how much easier was it for them to do the same? Mordred grew anxious as Aina's breath grew fainter. Her senses had been locked onto the young girl from the very beginning, but there was nothing she could do. Not to mention the fact she didn't have any healing spells in her arsenal. Even if she did, how would she have the time to cast it? Damn it. Jessica's expression remained cold and indifferent. She controlled her beast partners to maintain a safe distance while continuously harassing Mordred. "You all have no idea what you're doing." Mordred spoke through gritted teeth. "If that boy finds out what's happening here, he'll lose his mind." Mordred didn't know if Lionel's name held any weight in the Empire. She had seen Lionel's life, so she knew that he was nothing but a commoner in their eyes. She also knew that his gene analysis exam hadn't made him out to be one of the top-tier talents of the Ascension Empire. So she didn't bother to say Lionel's name. She only hoped to find an opening by speaking nonsense. In truth, Mordred didn't know if Lionel could make a difference either. She had no idea what was happening on the other battlefield. All she knew from Lionel's life was that the boy really hated to lose. Behind that unassuming, carefree smile, there was a wild beast he hadn't let out even now. But if there was one person who could cause him to unleash it, maybe in some ways the beast inside Lionel was the only thing that could compare to the monster inside Aina. Jessica paused slightly at Mordred's words. Though she didn't say a name, there was one person on this planet that she suddenly remembered she had yet to lay eyes on. Didn't His Majesty say that the second prince should be here? But why is it that he didn't appear on such an important battlefield? Noah kicked at Arthur's chest. With his knees bent and his arms completely focused on blocking Noah's saber from above, there was simply nothing Arthur could do. Bang! It felt as though he had been hit by a charging rhino. Noah's legs carried so much weight behind them that even Arthur's armor couldn't block all of the force. Arthur shot back like a ball out of a cannon, his body leaving streaks of whistling wind in its wake. Arthur! Guinevere's shout crossed the battlefield. But, being pincered from all sides, she couldn't take a step forward, let alone charge out on her own. Mordred's gaze flickered, biting down on her teeth so hard the blood almost leaked from her gums. Arthur struggled to stand. He could practically hear the cracking of his ribs beneath his strain. But he had to stand, he couldn't afford not to. It had been a long time since Arthur felt this way. The reality of not being good enough hadn't come crashing down around him for a good long while now. He realized at this moment that this was what he had been missing for so many years. Another mountain to climb, another peak to cross. Only like this could he avoid becoming that version of himself his wife almost abandoned and his daughter despised so. "All right, come on then." Arthur's voice came out in a growl. In fact, it wasn't even because he was enraged, he simply couldn't muster up the strength to project his true voice. Every breath made it feel as though thousands of daggers were stabbing into his lungs. "I guess I can only use it, then." Noah seemed to cross the distance between them in a single step, his saber swinging down as though a part of his body. The strike was fierce and all-encompassing. Maybe it was because Noah had run out of patience, but it seemed as though he had truly struck to kill this time. Without even the strength to lift his arms or even breathe properly, what chance did Arthur stand? No. Guinevere and Mordred struggled with all their might. Even Lancelot tried to push himself up from the ground, ignoring his broken legs. But it was all useless. It was at the moment Arthur's neck was about to be severed that his body suddenly flickered with a blinding golden light. In a mind-numbingly stupid feat, Arthur threw his sword to the side at the last instant. Clang! Noah's brow furrowed. His saber clashed against Arthur's armor. But there was no Arthur? A streak of golden light zipped about as Arthur's armor and Excalibur crashed to the ground. It shot around in a circle as though it could hardly control itself before landing just before Arthur's thrown sword. In one instant there was a streak of gold, and in the next, a naked man appeared, wielding a sword. Damn it! Arthur grit his teeth. He was king, but now his bare bottom was exposed for all to see. How was he going to live this one down? Chapter 493. Arthur concentrated, eventually managing to make his lower half a mist of light while maintaining a corporeal upper body. Only then did he sigh a breath of relief. His ability was far too difficult to control. It wasn't because its actual activation was difficult. That alone was as easy as breathing. It already felt as though it was a part of him. However, there were two problems. The first was that he couldn't take any objects with him when he activated his ability. Well, this wasn't entirely accurate. When it came to ordinary objects, if Arthur concentrated, he could turn them into flowing lights as well. He could even take these items with him as he entered his flowing light state. The issue was that he didn't have time to concentrate so much on a single task in battle. Beyond that, when it came to more substantial objects, the level of concentration needed increased explosively. The larger the object and the more valuable it was, the more difficult the process became. At Arthur's current level of proficiency, only the most mundane items from the third dimension could be taken with him. He couldn't even think of taking even the weakest fourth-dimensional existences, let alone his armor or Excalibur that were just mere half-steps from the fifth. Such a reality made Arthur's unwillingness obvious. If he wanted to use his ability, he would need to be stark naked. And even if he was willing to do this, he would have to abandon his weapon most of the time. However, aside from this, Arthur knew how truly frightening his ability could be if used properly. He was practically invulnerable, his affinity with the light element skyrocketed to the point that maybe only Lionel was above him in regards to citizens of Earth, and even that wasn't guaranteed. Also, in his flow-like state he could practically ignore the previous injuries to his body. This last part was maybe the most useful at this moment. Since Arthur's body was practically entirely formed of light particles, its individual parts were far less reliant on each other. If he controlled his injuries to entering a flow state, he wouldn't feel any pain. In addition, his healing accelerated in his flow state. Still, all of this led to his second problem: he was too fast. So fast that he couldn't even properly control his own body. It made it almost too difficult to battle in this state. His mind simply couldn't keep up with his movements. However, Noah didn't need to know this. Arthur just needed an opening. Just one opening to injure the prince enough to force him into a retreat. As long as he could do this, then they could stabilize Aina's situation and hopefully find another solution to deal with the empire. What Arthur didn't expect though, was that even as he was preparing to fight and even as Noah was sizing him up, that the battlefield would suddenly freeze. As though it had been plunged into an icy hell, their hearts all came to a grinding halt in that very instant. Moments ago, Lionel shot through the skies on his shuttle, leaving a trail of gold in his wake. The little mink snuggled cozily in his hair, a light black fog emitting from its body. The good thing about Camelot was that he didn't need to worry about invalids. Maybe it was because of their origin, but as the people of Camelot awakened to their abilities, none of them failed. This might very well have been another hidden reward of a mythological zone. Right now, Earth was indeed in dire need of population. They hardly had a few million people remaining. Of course, Camelot's appearance might not even double their current populace, but such an influx of talents couldn't be underestimated. As things stood at the moment, these people of Camelot wouldn't be useful in a short time. But, if there were some changes to the overall political climate of Camelot, they wouldn't be a long ways away from becoming assets. The situation in the Demon Empire has been stabilized. If White City committed as much manpower as I think they did, they're likely not far away from being finished. The only remaining variable is City Lord White and her power level. Unfortunately, though Lionel was likely more informed about terrain than most others of Earth, he was still lacking in such details. Though he understood how strength levels functioned in the fourth dimension now, that wouldn't help him very much unless he could personally lay eyes on City Lord White. I should have enough trump cards to deal with the situation. But it's odd, the Empire's army. Why haven't I run into them yet? Lionel shook his head, a light smile suddenly coating his face as he thought of something. Aina's birthday should be tomorrow? Just a couple hours actually. I wonder if she'll like her present. Lionel's eyes glowed. He had given Aina a lot of space in the past few months, allowing her the time she needed to work through her emotions. Though he considered himself to have high emotional intelligence, he was still new to romantic relationships. His entire mind was filled with idealized versions of love he had seen in those vintage movies his dad always made him watch. But those movies always ended when the guy got the girl. Why did none of them ever explain what to do after that? Oh, that should be the HM? Lionel's mind went blank. He saw a massive battlefield filled with corpses, many of which didn't seem to have a single ounce of blood remaining within them. However, this wasn't what shocked Lionel. There were all sorts of people with all sorts of abilities. It wasn't too hard to believe that someone might have a blood-leeching ability. What shocked him was the fact that he could see what remained of White City's army still retreating into the distance, turning tail from the battlefield as fast as they could. Lionel could easily pick them out even without having participated in the battle. The black robes accented by white soft armor was too easy for him to pick out with his senses. But, if White City was retreating, why was there still a massive battle going on down below? Lionel's gaze swept through, his mind working in overdrive as he tried to piece together what he was seeing. He first laid eyes on Guinevere, who had become the core of a group rebuffing what looked like a bunch of youths with astonishing strength. Then there was King Arthur, who had shed his armor? Where were his feet and legs? How had they become rays of light? Mordred? She was battling another youth who seemed to be a beast master? Where did all these young elites come from? Lionel's gaze narrowed with understanding. As expected, according to his previous analysis, the Empire wouldn't have taken Camelot very seriously and would use it as a training ground for their promising talents. So it seemed that they had repelled White City but broke down due to infighting in the end anyway? But even if they wanted to fight, would they really choose to do so right here and right now? Something must have sparked it? What could have? Lionel froze. In that moment, the whole world seemed to vanish. In his vision, only a petite young woman madly convulsing remained. Lionel's heart stopped beating, his breath becoming as shallow as a dead man's. He watched as Jessica tried to direct her beasts around Mordred, forcing the Demon Empress to block them. He watched as Noah blocked Arthur's path toward healing the young woman. He watched as Niall and the others tried to press past Guinevere's troop. And then he saw red. Chapter 494. Wild fluctuations of red-violet aura surged around Lionel. A towering tornado of force swirled around his body, bronze runes flickering into existence across his skin. The little mink woke from his nap, low growl standing its hair on end. At that moment, everyone's sights focused toward the same direction. With how high up Lionel's shuttle had been, he was nothing but a faint black dot in the sky. But there was no denying the surge of energy coming from that direction. Even those without the ability to see so far could feel the changes. Lionel's shuttle morphed into a surfboard, streaking down from the clouds as though a meteor crashing toward the earth. By the time he got in range for those without sensory abilities to see him clearly, the cold stoicism on his face was all anyone could seem to focus on. It felt as though it was a dam holding back the raging waters of his fury. Beneath that placid exterior, there was a volcano on the verge of eruption. Seeing Lionel's appearance, Mordred was among the few who sighed a breath of relief. She knew that if Lionel was here, then that must mean that the situation on the other battlefield had already been dealt with. And, judging by his current appearance, it was also clear that he already had a minor grasp of exactly what was happening here. Isn't he descending too fast though? Mordred couldn't help but worry. She knew how deep Lionel's feelings for Aina were. In such a situation she couldn't even be certain that he would care much about his own safety. Just as Mordred was about to try to warn Lionel, his surfboard came to a grinding halt, causing her heart to stutter. The shearing forces of such abrupt changes in speed would be no different to crashing into the ground. Was Lionel trying to kill himself? However, what was even more shocking than this was the fact that Lionel seemed completely unaffected. In fact, before anyone could wonder why he was still 20 meters above the ground, his surfboard vanished, leaving him to plummet to the ground on his own. At that moment, Niall finally awoke from his stupor. He didn't know who this person was, but judging by the way his gaze had been locked onto Aina from start to finish, Niall could already guess what this unknown entity's goal was. Stop him. Long-ranged units, fire. Niall had already been directing a small troop against Guinevere and the remaining 5 knights of the Round Table. So, hearing his new orders now, the transition was seamless. However, it was as though Lionel couldn't even see the arrows streaking toward him. He hardly said a word, yet a strong current of earth elemental energies formed a bronze bell around him. The barrage didn't even stand a chance. Let alone cracking Lionel's defenses, they rebounded away without suspense. Bang! Lionel crashed heavily into the ground. However, the sight of him breaking several bones or becoming a pile of mush never occurred. A small crater splintered out beneath his weight. But Lionel had hardly felt his 2 feet touch earth before he shot forward. For a moment he looked no different from King Arthur. His body almost became a streak of golden light, blazing a trail past Niall and his men to appear beside Aina in a flash. No one could react. Not a single soul could even comprehend what was happening. How had a single person managed to complete what so many of them had been trying to for the last several minutes? Lionel fell to his knees beside Aina's convulsing body, his gaze finally giving way to emotion. Watching her in this state, he almost felt as though her pain was his own. The pain of opening his lineage factor, the torture he had put his hands through over the past months, even those savage beatings he had taken at the hands of Lamorak. None of those things could match the pain he was feeling now. He didn't care about the foul odor coming from Aina's body, nor did he care that her face was completely unrecognizable beneath the inflamed scars that had begun to travel down her neck. He slid a hand beneath her head, hoping that the tilt would help her expel more of the black blood without her choking on it. What do I do? What's wrong with her? Lionel's first instinct was to cast as many grand heal as he could. But his instincts told him doing so would be useless. Ping. Replying to seed, 1-star monolayered curse detected. According to analysis, curse was implemented during infancy, making it near the strength of a 4-star tetralayered curse in efficacy. Lionel's pupils flickered. A curse? He didn't know anything about them. He wasn't sure of what the nomenclature meant and what the difference between a 1-star monolayered curse and a 4-star tetralayered curse was. But this did confirm one thing to him. Aina's scars weren't so simple. Before, he thought that the reason the cleansing waters managed to help their inflammation was due to the fact it had cured them of their infections. To a layman, Aina's scars looked like infected wounds that might burst with pus at any moment. In fact, Lionel thought this was the case as well. Cleansing water had the ability to rid the body of impurities, refresh the mind, and heal minor injuries. As far as Lionel was aware, anyway. He never truly felt anything particularly special about the cleansing waters, especially since his supply was so abundant. It wasn't until Aina spoke of its specialness that he finally raised an eyebrow. But now it was exactly what Aina needed. The segmented cube appeared. Under Lionel's control, streams of water exited and flowed into Aina's nostrils and lips. The effect was slow and hardly noticeable, but with Lionel's senses he easily picked up on them. Though the impact wasn't as great as Lionel hoped, it was still a small light at the end of the tunnel. Lionel's gaze suddenly sharpened. With calm movements, he sent Aina into the bathhouse of the segmented cube. If she was immersed in water, the process would be much easier. Take care of her, Black Star. Lionel sent the little mink in after her and slowly rose, his cold demeanor returning. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes locking onto Niall's legion. Which one of you is responsible for what happened? The voice was emotionless and soft, but those who heard it felt as though they had been thrust into the pits of hell. Chapter 495. Lionel's gaze locked onto Niall, who had begun to approach him with their group. Niall's jaw clenched, his body tensing. It felt like a python was slowly constricting around his body. This sort of aura, he had only ever sensed it from Prince Noah. He didn't understand how such presence could also come from a young man who seemed to be at least a few years his junior. However, Niall remained standing. Other than his slightly abnormal breathing, one would never think that anything was wrong with him. This is the official business of the Empire and His Highness, Prince Fox. This isn't something you should meddle in. Lionel slowly turned to face Niall. Is that the question I asked? Indifference. Disregard. One could easily see by Lionel's wrist that much like Aina, he too was a citizen of the Empire. But, unlike Aina, who had chosen to acquiesce to their demands for the sake of not splintering relations, Lionel simply did not care. I asked you a very simple question. Lionel took a step forward. Who is responsible? Niall stood, his spine shivering. He gripped his spear as tightly as he could, trying to calm himself. But, despite the endless battles he had experienced, he couldn't seem to find any sense of peace beneath Lionel's glare. It was fine for someone of Camelot to not understand the strength of the Empire, but Lionel, as a person who had grown up within its walls and been indoctrinated since birth, shouldn't be so ignorant. It should be almost impossible for anyone indoctrinated to such an extent to defect, especially not if they were so talented. Anyone with Lionel's level of talent was most definitely a 5-star professional. Such existences received the best schooling and had the deepest understanding of the Empire. Their deification of the Fox royal family should practically be ingrained into their bones. Yet, Lionel didn't even blink an eye when the Empire was mentioned. His breathing didn't hitch, his heart didn't skip a beat, his eyes didn't even blink. At that moment, Niall didn't deny it any longer. If he opened his mouth and told Lionel that the Emperor himself was responsible, there was no doubt that Lionel would brandish his spear toward the capital. It was me. I gave the order for her capture. At that moment, a calm voice sounded. Such a voice should have soothed the atmosphere, but the brunt of it held an aura that soared, colliding with Lionel's. For a moment, the muffled sounds of 2 clashing titans reverberated through the air. However, it was for just a moment. Because upon hearing such words, Lionel didn't breathe a word. As though a beast released from its chain, violent winds surged around Lionel's foot as he planted on the ground hard, shooting toward Noah, a red-violet color flickering in his gaze. Prince? Niall's eyes widened. He forced his body to move, trying to intercept Lionel's path. Lionel almost seemed to look through Niall. It was as though the latter hadn't blocked his path in the slightest. He might as well have been no different from a gust of wind. The prince isn't someone you can casually cross. Niall roared, but from an objective party's vantage point, he seemed to be trying to shout his fear away. Those who were just under his command, even to this point, didn't seem to have the ability to move in the slightest. Even after seeing through to Lionel's goal, they felt that their movements were sluggish and uncoordinated. Niall brandished his spear, piercing it forward with all his might. Crackling lightning flickered within his irises, dancing within them and leaving arcs of blue in their wake. His spear seemed to react in kind, its tip crackling with the same fierceness. Niall didn't believe that the bronze bell that surrounded Lionel could deflect his strike just as easily. But what was shocking was that the illusory bell dissipated just when Lionel entered the range of Niall's blade. Piss off. Lionel said coldly, his fist whipping forward. The sound of his bones popping and his muscles stretching resounded. In one moment, Lionel seemed like just a single man. But in the next he was like the scorching sun. Niles couldn't believe that Lionel would try to meet his spear with a bare hand. He had never seen such a foolish battle tactic. Even if Lionel was a master of hand-to-hand combat, shouldn't he at least use gloves to cover his flesh? However, what truly happened left Niall at a complete loss. Just when it seemed that Lionel's fist would be split in two, his spear completely shattered. In that moment he felt as though someone was looking at him from above, a gaze of indifference and disdain coloring their features. To use a spear before a god, what was he thinking? All thoughts of resistance crumbled. He couldn't even react before Lionel's fist tore a hole through his collarbone and shoulder. The strike was so fierce and swift that he wasn't even thrown back. He looked down at his barely attached arm, the pain still not having traveled to his brain just yet. But by then Lionel had already shot by him and appeared before Noah. Lionel's strike was so fast that not even the faintest hint of blood could be found on him. Yet the punch he sent toward Noah seemed to be far beyond the first. The world seemed to revolve around Lionel. Scenes of mellow springs, harsh winters, blazing summers and vibrant falls whirled around him. Universal force fell down from above, illuminating Lionel in a golden halo that seemed to fuse perfectly with his violet bronze aura. Noah reacted quickly, sending a fist forward with his free hand. Lionel was simply too fast, he didn't have the time to swing his saber or lower its weight. However, his body had already been refined to the point of rivaling Diamond during his battle with Arthur. He didn't believe that Lionel's body could be stronger than his own. Unfortunately, what was a diamond, a third-dimensional rock, in comparison to a body refined to the standards of a fourth-dimensional metal? Bang! Noah winced. He felt his skin fracture in several places before an unimaginable strength traveled through his arm and into his body. He was sent flying tens of meters, his body crashing into the ground and leaving a half-a-meter-deep trench as it was dragged along. The pain she experienced, it'll make you suffer tenfold. Lionel's back stood as straight as a javelin, vibrant energy swirling around him. His bronze hair sounded like snapped whips in the wind, a radiant halo shimmering above his head. His violet-red eyes locked onto the prince, a deep, murderous aura exuding from him. Prince of an empire? He didn't care. He would make him pay. Chapter 496. Prince? Jessica's countenance shifted. She hadn't believed that the difference between Lionel and Noah would be so stark. But by the time she was ready to make a move, Mordred had blocked her path. I already warned you what would happen if you continued down this path. He isn't a person that likes to kill, so don't force him to. It's better if you let him vent his rage. If you try to interfere, I can't guarantee that you'll come out in one piece. Jessica almost couldn't believe the ridiculous nature of Mordred's words. Her cold expression cracked, giving way to a slight hint of rage. Let me through. Mordred waved her wand, causing several black tendrils of darkness to shoot up from the ground, obstructing the path of Jessica's beasts. The aura around Lionel soared. The pillar of golden light enveloping him made it seem as though he was a chosen. His rage was the universe's rage. If he wanted someone to suffer, they would. Nothing more, nothing less. Noah stood from the ground, a deep frown coloring his face as he looked toward the fractures trailing up his arm. Normal skin wouldn't fracture like this, but he had changed the chemical structure of his own. Though it made it far harder, it also gained an added brittleness it didn't have before. Usually, it would be impossible to reach the threshold necessary to crack his skin. Yet, Lionel had done it with a single casual punch. Noah's jaw steeled, his saber raising into the air. He didn't think that he would run into someone so powerful here. By now, he was more than 90% certain that this person was in fact Lionel. He didn't believe that there was anyone else on this moon who could have such strength and also be a member of the Empire. And that aura. Only the royal family had it, only those with fox blood running through their veins could display such presence. However, even though Noah was almost certain of this, he didn't voice his conjectures. He had his own pride. To weasel his way out of this situation by revealing his identity would be something beneath his dignity. And even if he was willing to do such a debasing thing, Noah still didn't know much about Lionel. For all he knew, Lionel was already aware of his identity and didn't even care about the fact they were of the same blood. The only person Noah would lower his head to was his grandfather. As for anyone else, they could taste his saber. Noah grew explosively in size, soon reaching to just over 3 meters. Though he wasn't as the 5-meter height he reached when battling City Lord White, the density of his bones, blood and muscle couldn't even be compared. This was his true strongest state. The sound of slashing winds circled around him, his blue blade radiating with a glow. "You stepped into the peak of the Four Seasons realm," Noah said coldly. By his demeanor, he was clearly not asking a question. Rather, he was simply stating a fact. But just by his mere actions, Jessica and the others were stunned. Noah wasn't a person who spoke in battle, he was a person who hardly spoke at all. Yet he was actually doing exactly that now. Though your fist force is powerful, it's only the product of someone else's understanding. They'll show you the true Four Seasons realm. Noah's indifferent voice faded beneath the sound of howling winds. At that moment, the temperature plummeted, an icy chill seeping into all of their bodies. In the beginning, Noah thought that Lionel's fist force had been comprehended by himself. This reality left him feeling somewhat stifled. To succeed in such a thing at such a young age was far beyond anything Noah had ever seen before. But it was after Noah's fist came into contact with Lionel's that he knew that this wasn't quite right. Somehow, Lionel's Four Seasons realm seemed above the second-tier comprehension, but below the self-comprehended third tier. This gave the illusion that it was more powerful than it really was. That said, even though Noah hadn't reached completion of the Four Seasons realm and could only embody winter, he had relied on himself. Noah shot forward, his icy blue blade carrying with it the heart of winter's past. Lionel stood amidst the harsh winds. He could even feel his own universe force weakening beneath Noah's. Images of a harsh winter landscape enveloped the battlefield. The sun in the sky seemed to dim and the land beneath their feet seemed to quickly become covered in ice. Lionel sank into a boxer's stance. He didn't keep his spear hidden as a trump card. He didn't ignore his bow for the sake of making a point. He used his fist simply because he wanted to feel Noah's flesh deform beneath his knuckles. He wanted to savor the cracking of his bones, the bleeding of his flesh. They say that every dragon has a reverse scale. It was just unfortunate that Noah had yet to realize that he had touched Lionel's. Lionel's right hand hung up by his chin, his left leaning forward. Just when Noah's icy domain seemed to envelop him completely, he moved again, the violet red of his gaze flickering. Lionel's left jabbed. It was a movement without the slightest wasted effort. Images of a winged swordsman perfectly matching his footwork to his attacks played in Lionel's mind, allowing his body to slide into the style seamlessly. A halo of universe force coated Lionel's fist as he met Noah's blade. All the air of the battlefield seemed to surge toward the two. Barely a foot of space separated Noah's blade from the flesh of Lionel's fist, but neither could seem to move forward even another inch. Bang. The air concentrated into a single point before exploding outward with a raging ferocity. The accumulating snow was blasted away, leaving a crater of brown soil around them. Noah's emerald eyes looked down at Lionel, his white gold hair whipping beneath the aftermath of their clash. Lionel looked up to meet his gaze, a fury hidden deep within their indifference. Noah coughed suddenly, blood leaking from his lips as his arm trembled. Chapter 497. When he met Lionel's fist, Noah felt as though he had crashed into an immovable wall. All the strength he placed into his strike seemed to reflect back, reverberating throughout his body in an unbridled fashion. In this form he concentrated all of his strength into power. As a result, his inner organs were completely unprotected, leaving him suffering the brunt of a strike he wasn't quite prepared for. Noah could tell that his use of universe force was beyond Lionel's. Yet their overall strength was too far apart. Noah didn't know what Lionel's ability was, but at this moment he had no choice but to believe that Lionel had a body-related ability even better than his own. No, it isn't that simple. He's too fast, more than 3 or 4 times as fast as I am in this form. And instead of using the speed to whittle me down slowly, he can instead perfectly fuse his movement with his attack, giving his punches far more strength than they otherwise would have. Noah shuddered when he had this thought. An elite fighter would be able to bring out 80 to 90% of their full strength consistently, only monsters would be able to touch upon 95% and above consistently. But even the greatest masters shouldn't be able to guarantee touching 100%. Yet, if Noah's calculations were correct, let alone using 100% of his strength, Lionel was closer to 200 or even 300%. This is a martial art. By this point, Noah realized that this perfect fusion of speed and attack had to be a style. There was no other explanation. But Noah had never run across a style so perfect for a person. Such a boost to strength, it was unimaginable. Unfortunately for Noah, Lionel seemed to have no intention of stopping. The instant his left jab blocked Noah's strike, his hips had already spun, winding with a fear-inducing amount of torque. Lionel's body was like a streak of light, crossing into Noah's attack range and hooking a punch at his torso. Lionel didn't seem to care that Noah stood a meter taller than him. Even if he was 10 meters taller, Lionel would cut him down just the same. Noah's torso flexed, the armors he wore radiating with a faint light. But Lionel's right fist continued as though he didn't sense a thing. Bang. Noah felt as though all the air in his lungs had been knocked out at once. He swung his saber to the side trying to get Lionel to back off. But because of its length, the blade was effectively a mid-ranged weapon, in such close quarters, its flexibility was lacking. Lionel simply shifted to the side, rolling his shoulder to block the flat of Noah's blade. His movements held a natural air to them, interrupting the prince's attempt. Lionel's fists suddenly accelerated. His form was textbook, as though he was perfectly reflecting the dreams of all orthodox boxing. A quick three-punch combo left shocking dents in Noah's armor. From afar, it looks as though 3 cannonballs had crashed into his torso, shredding his inner organs to minced meat. But the armor recovered quickly. In the blink of an eye, it was as though nothing had happened at all. Unfortunately for Noah, Lionel's barrage didn't come to a stop. The fists rained down with such speed and quickness that pain was all Noah could feel. Even his attempts at brandishing his saber ended in vicious counters that left his right arm practically useless. If Noah didn't know better, he would think that Lionel's ability was to see the future. Even before his muscles could twitch, Lionel's fist would interrupt his next attempted movement, leaving his mouth practically foaming with blood. "Your Highness." Jessica's cold, aloof expression finally collapsed completely. Sensing Jessica's agitation, the 4-armed white ape seemed to have a breakthrough, charging past Mordred's blockade. A sharp gash appeared on its back, leaving its white fur matted in blood. But it didn't seem to notice, its enraged roar bearing down on Lionel from his back. "Lionel!" Mordred shouted out a warning. She was a veteran of battle. She could tell that the difference between Noah and Lionel wasn't so large. It was just that Lionel's combat effectiveness had gained him the upper hand. Mordred knew that this was reliant on Lionel's ability. But just as easily as Lionel gained the initiative, he could just as easily lose it. The reality, though, was that Mordred still underestimated Lionel. Lionel didn't even turn back to the ape. He pretended as though it wasn't approaching him at all. Noah tried to retreat, but between the two of them, who had the greater speed? And, with Lionel's ability to predict Noah's movements before they even came to fruition, what chance did he have of distancing himself from Lionel's fists? Noah's armor became like a field of fallen meteors. Lionel's movements were so perfect and flawless that even the strength of his punches didn't seem to be enough to give Noah any momentum to retreat. Lionel stuck to him as though dancing to a rhythm. Every time the ape came close enough to attack, Lionel's hips would shift and his feet would shuffle, his barrage of attacks forcing Noah's back toward the infuriated ape. Noah's eyes lost focus, his body seizing. Whatever control he had over his ability faded, causing his figure to shrink. Lionel's rain of fists was relentless. His cold and indifferent gaze flashed with a ruby red. It felt as though he couldn't hit this prince enough, as though no amount of pain Noah suffered would appease him. He didn't even care about the expenditure of his dream force. He had long since activated his dreamscape battle sense in full force. There was nothing more he wanted in this world than to bury this bastard. "Please, please stop." Jessica's voice was hardly rose over the sound of Lionel's fists hitting Noah. Even as his own blood coated his knuckles, he hardly reacted in the slightest. "Please, Lionel. He's your cousin. You share a grandfather. Stop." Chapter 498. Lionel's endless barrage of fists suddenly came to a grinding halt, his indifferent gaze flickering. Unconscious, Noah finally fell heavily to the ground, his breathing short and hurried. Maybe he could consider himself lucky to be in such a state, or it would be impossible to measure the amount of pain he would be in. At that moment, the roaring white ape finally got an opening to attack, but it seemed to lose its will when Lionel swept a gaze over it. It felt a heavy gravity field envelop it, making its knees tremble. Lionel frowned, shifting his senses toward Jessica, who was still in a state of agitation. Ignoring everything else, Lionel's palm flipped over to reveal the flat disc-like dictionary. "Who is my grandfather?" Ping! The dictionary flickered, causing Lionel's eyes to narrow. It had been a long time since one of his questions caused a recording to appear. Usually, if Lionel didn't want to watch a mechanical version of his father, he had to go back and watch the lessons his old man left on force crafting. But it seemed he wouldn't have to this time. I never expected you to ask this question." Lionel's father appeared with his usual carefree demeanor, scratching the back of his head. Eventually he pushed his glasses up and looked forward. "I know you wouldn't care enough to ask on your own, so it must have been some busybody flapping their gums a bit too much." What a headache." Lionel didn't seem to realize that the entire battlefield had focused on him. In fact, the others felt their knees go weak, any surprise they felt for Lionel being a member of the royal family being washed away by the sight of the man in the projection. It wasn't because they recognized who this man was, but because just his projection made them feel as though they were standing in the presence of a wild beast. But what was maybe more shocking was the fact that Lionel seemed completely unaffected. Lionel had lived with his father all his life, so how could he possibly notice the kind of effect he had on others? Just his mere projection was like a stranglehold on all those who saw it. It felt like his words were accusing them of wrongdoing, as though it was their fault Lionel was asking this question and that he now had to answer it. Noah coughed violently at Lionel's feet, but simply had no strength to stand. Even knowing that Lionel was looming over him, there was nothing he could do. His eyes locked onto the projection. He didn't know who this man was, but considering his resemblance to Lionel, was this the uncle his grandfather had said was far beyond what his mother could compare to? Forget it. Your grandfather is dead. Lionel's expression flickered. He suddenly realized that this recording must be about his other grandfather, unless Jessica had really been lying, that is. As far as he was aware, Emperor Fox wasn't dead, so this could only mean that his father wasn't talking about him. Still, Lionel didn't react much to this. His grandparents had never been in his life, so one way or another, he had always assumed they were dead. Like his mother before he had memories of her, he didn't care much. He didn't care much until he saw a flicker of rage in his father's expression. In all his life, Lionel had never seen his father become angry. Much of his own personality came from his father, the same cheery, charming smile they shared obviously originated from him. There was only one time Lionel could even remember his father displaying any emotion other than carefreeness, and that was when he spoke about treating familiars like friends. Back then, Lionel's father had been adamant that he must treat his metal spirit well. But even then, though his father had formed a murderous aura, it wasn't rage. It wasn't this kind of visceral gut punch this projection was reflecting now. The temperature of the surroundings seemed to plummet. This part of the recording will only trigger if you've mentioned Scarlet Star Force and your grandfather, while also reaching a certain standard of strength. It seems that you haven't just yet, so this is all I will say. The recording flickered and disappeared, leaving Lionel staring coldly at the silver disc in his hand. His father's words were short and brisk, but they already made his already foul mood worse. Jessica panicked. When she sensed the shift in Lionel's mood, she thought that he would think she had been lying. Though she didn't know what that treasure of Lionel's was, she could tell that Lionel trusted it. But it was also impossible for Emperor Fox to be dead. Just saying such a thing was tantamount to questioning the royal family's sovereignty, not that Jessica dared to bring up such a thing now. It must be his paternal grandfather that recording is speaking about. That's right, I just need him to ask about his mater. Before Jessica could finish her thought, Lionel had already spoken again, his voice carrying a chill several times more potent than the last. Is Emperor Fox my grandfather? Ping. To Lionel's surprise, another recording formed soon after the first. This time, his father's presence was much more casual. Even still, Jessica and others felt as though their bodies were being constricted to the point where even breathing became difficult. Oh, you finally found out about that old fart, huh? Those members of the Empire choked on their own spit. This was the Emperor they were talking about. Who dared to call him an old fart? Gervais is indeed your grandfather. Only after meeting him did I learn where your mother gets her hard-headedness. Now that I think about it, you're stubborn like that too, Aya, my precious gene pool. I should consider getting myself a concubine or something. Lionel's father unwittingly shivered and looked over his shoulder as though checking for something. Only then did he sigh a breath of relief, feeling pleased with himself as though he had gotten away with something. Still, be careful of that old fart. His ambitions reach far and family isn't his main priority. Whatever, he's still your grandfather. Do as you please, I guess. Chapter 499. Maybe when someone learned that they secretly had a great background, they would be ecstatic. All their worries and hardships would now be coming to an end and they could finally live out a life of peace. However, this wasn't how Lionel reacted in the slightest. The first thing he thought of when he learned the truth was the number of people who had died when the metamorphosis began. No, died wasn't the proper term. They had been sacrificed. For the sake of having an easier path of development and having less invalids to deal with, these people had been discarded like trash by this emperor that also happened to be his grandfather. Lionel didn't particularly feel abandoned by his grandfather either. Another human reaction would be to feel as though his existence had been ignored for so long. If his grandfather knew he had another grandson, why didn't he come into contact with him sooner? But once again, Lionel didn't feel like this. Lionel could tell from all the clues that his father likely originated from a higher dimensional world. If he couldn't piece this together, then whatever worth his calculative mind had would be next to zero. Due to understanding this, he knew that the relation between his family members was likely quite strained and odd. By convention, a son-in-law should respect his father-in-law, but it was difficult to do so if the son-in-law's standing was so much higher. Things might be fine if Gervais Fox was a normal man, but he was the emperor of maybe the most talented fledgling world in existence. He was used to lording over people and having unmatched status, so what kind of oddities would it cause if his daughter suddenly married someone above him? The first thought that someone would have in this situation was that Emperor Fox might use the Morales clan to climb to a larger stage. But, judging by his father's demeanor, Lionel could tell that he actually had respect for his grandfather. Knowing his father, it was impossible for him to respect someone who would use such means to climb the social ladder. This likely meant that not only did his grandfather likely have a demeanor that at the very least treated Lionel's father as an equal, it also meant that it was even more likely that he treated Lionel's father as someone beneath him. If those of the dimensional verse knew that a man of the third dimension had dared to treat a core member of the Morales clan in such a way, who knows how they would react? The Morales clan was so powerful that even an infant could likely eradicate a fourth-dimensional world on its own, let alone a third-dimensional world which Earth had been at the time of their meeting. Thinking to this point, Lionel suddenly felt he understood the odd relationship between his father and grandfather. If Emperor Fox really cared about using the Morales family and Lionel's father was in the way of this, he would have simply contacted Lionel after his father had left. Lionel wasn't a fool. Since his father could leave both of the family's heirlooms with him, it meant that his standing in the Morales family wouldn't be small in the future either. But obviously, this hadn't happened. However, this didn't make Lionel suddenly warm up to this man he had been indoctrinated to worship since his youth, nor did his emotions toward the Empire change because of it. Lionel sent a glance toward Noah, their gazes locking. He could see the same cold indifference in the latter's eyes. It didn't seem to matter that most of his bones were broken and that he couldn't even stand if he wanted to. Noah didn't say a word even as he met Lionel's look. There was no pleading, no smugness, no expectation. He was simply there. It seemed that whether Lionel chose to cripple him or kill him right then and there, he wouldn't flinch in the slightest. Jessica panicked again seeing that Lionel hadn't retreated. We didn't know that she was related to you." Jessica felt helpless. This was the only thing she could say. They truly hadn't known about Aina. The Emperor never said anything about her to them. They were only aware of Lionel's appearance here due to Emperor Fox in the first place. Since he hadn't said anything about Aina, how could they know? But the argument was feeble and Jessica knew it. A Brazinger was a Brazinger in the end. Even if they knew Aina was related to Lionel, there was no guarantee that they wouldn't have made a move anyway. And, beyond that, this was more than just a matter of attacking a perceived enemy, it was also about attacking someone who was very likely the reason you won this battle to begin with. Even if Noah had stopped holding back and unleashed his full power like he had against Lionel, it was unlikely that City Lord White would have been defeated if not for Aina. So, what was their excuse for this exactly? Lionel didn't respond to Jessica's words. In truth, he still wasn't aware of everything that had happened in this place. So, he obviously wasn't aware that Aina was the reason they had won the battle. That said, the fact that she had risked herself fighting for the Empire only to be treated like this in the end. This thought alone was enough to fuel his rage. Lionel turned and walked away, breaking free of Noah's gaze without a word. He crossed the battlefield and entered the segmented cube that remained waiting for him. He didn't want to bear the burden of killing a family member. But, more importantly than that, he wouldn't be able to bear doing such a thing until he understood how his mother would feel about such a thing. For now he would let Noah go. With Lionel's disappearance, a heavy fog that hung over the battlefield seemed to dissipate. Arthur coughed lightly, sliding back into his armor to hide away his naked body. That boy sure is a demon when he gets pissed off." Arthur shook his head, his lips curling. "And here I thought I finally met one of those beauty is more than skin-deep unicorns. To think that the girl he fawns over so much is actually such a beauty, what a sly fox." Arthur looked around at the mess the battlefield had become and shook his head. It seemed he would have to deal with all the heavy lifting. At this very moment, news of City Lord White's death had already traveled to the ears of the Kiafur family. Chapter 500. When Lionel walked into the bathhouse, his rage flared again. If it wasn't because Aina was in such a bad situation and needed him by her side, he might have run out again to give Noah an even more savage beating. Noah might have been his cousin, but the feeling Lionel had for Aina far outweighed whatever weak familial ties he had with him. Noah couldn't magically gain a higher regard in his heart just off the strength of their connection. While Noah was just a lost family member he had only just learned about, Aina was a woman Lionel deeply cared about. As far as he was concerned, she was his other half. Only his father and mother could hold a comparable place. The current Aina was far better than she had been just moments ago, but the struggle she was facing was still present. If it wasn't for little Blackstar using ropes of darkness to hold her in place, she might have drowned herself by now. The water splashed about, blackening under the secretions coming from Aina's body. Under some mysterious power, the cleansing water purified this blackness the further it traveled from Aina. But, unfortunately, the density around her only seemed to grow with each passing moment. Lionel stripped off his robes and entered the waters, a deep frown on his face. He propped the back of Aina's head up while submerging the rest of her body. This isn't working. Lionel shook his head and brought Aina to the edge of the pool. Using it, he pulled Aina's military boots off. When Lionel got a look at Aina's skin, he paled. He hadn't noticed before because the entirety of Aina's face and much of her neck was covered in those savage pulsing scars. But after taking her boots off, he realized just how severe the situation was. Aina's skin, which had always had a healthy tan hue to it, was suddenly as pale as a sheet of paper. As though this wasn't terrible enough, Lionel could see her veins popping out, completely filled with a vicious black liquid that slowed the beating of her heart and clogged her arteries. Lionel moved quickly, propping up Aina's other foot to take her other boot off. But at that moment something surprising happened. When Aina's bare foot entered the waters once again, there was a burst as a torrent of foul blood was suddenly pulled out by the cleansing water. Beneath the surface, Lionel's senses could make out how Aina's pores had opened. In fact, her skin even broke, revealing the veins beneath before healing once again. But, despite the injuries to her feet, Lionel immediately sensed a slight sigh of relief come from her lips. That's it, Lionel hesitated. Then he furiously shook his head. This wasn't the time to be a prude. Light curtain. Lionel mumbled beneath his breath, causing a surge of light to cover Aina's body. The benefit of light curtain was that it obstructed one's vision by causing a large gathering of light. But it didn't have a physical form, so it didn't impede Lionel's actions in the slightest. Lionel realized at that point that Aina's military uniform and boots weren't normal. They protected her in battle and also had a series of spatial pockets hidden within. In that case, they were very likely impeding whatever help the cleansing waters were supposed to provide. Under normal circumstances they would be a protection. But at the moment they were nothing more than a hindrance. Lionel hadn't noticed it before, but the uniform itself wasn't even wet. Stealing his resolve, Lionel began to unbutton Aina's clothing. Focus. Focus. If those who had just been scared witless by Lionel saw him now, who knows how they'd react. A young man who seemed to have the strength to overturn a world in his hands was panicking at the prospect of undressing a girl. It was a sad sight to behold indeed. Above Lionel, the little mink skipped about, making a noise that sounded like snickering. His long whiskers bounced about, a lively light in his beady little eyes. Lionel ignored the little guy, his normally nimble fingers fumbling about. Focus. Lionel shouted to himself, splitting his mind several ways. If others knew he was using such a profound ability just to dull his first ambiguous situation with a woman, Lionel's legend would surely become one big joke. Lionel's hands reached the end of Aina's buttons. Grabbing hold of her waist, he gently pulled the fabric out from their tucked position. His gaze focused on Aina's face, trying to make sure that he wasn't harming her in any way. When the waters flooded past the opening in Aina's clothing, the flood of black blood became more exaggerated. More of Aina's pores opened up, the foul liquid being pulled out by some odd osmosis. Lionel's hands slipped. After untucking Aina's military garb, he realized that there was nothing beneath but her soft skin, causing his breathing to hitch. Lionel had no idea that just moments before, Aina had snapped the bandages she used to cover her chest, leaving nothing between the fabric and her skin. With a deep gulp, Lionel carefully shifted Aina in his arms, the blinding lights of light curtain blocking his view. Carefully, he slipped her arms out of their sleeves and tossed the military uniform to the side. Lionel laid her to rest in the waters. As expected, the speed of her recovery accelerated. Lionel could even see the grotesque scars that had begun crawling toward her heart retreating at a speed a normal human would be able to spot. This left him breathing a sigh of relief. Alright, one more layer. Taking a deep breath, Lionel rested Aina's back against his bare chest and undid her pants, slowly sliding them off with a forearm wrapped around her waist. So, Lionel shook his head, trying to push such thoughts out of his mind. But just the skin of Aina's back felt so supple against his chest. He felt as though he was on cloud 9. But at the same time he felt guilty. Aina might have been quickly recovering, but she wasn't quite out of the woods yet. He didn't want to think about such things. Aina's military pants finally slid off her slender legs, allowing Lionel to toss them to the side as well. Chapter 501. Lionel sighed a breath of relief. Once again the speed of Aina's recovery shot up again. Sitting in the pool, Lionel allowed her to rest against his chest. Soon, her breathing stopped hitching and became calm, and her head fell back against Lionel, the light sound of snoring coming from her parted lips. Lionel smiled. He quite liked this feeling. The way he could envelop her small frame in his arms and protect her, it made him feel at peace. Lionel chuckled lightly. As expected of Aina, rather than wearing delicate female underwear, from what Lionel could tell, she actually wore male boxers. Her reasoning was probably that it was more comfortable, at least for battle. Of course, Lionel was too much of a pansy to actually look with his eyes. He could just tell by how the fabric felt on his thighs. Had Mordred been there, she would have most definitely rolled her eyes. Lionel cast a silencing array over Aina's ears and brought out the dictionary once again, his expression becoming more serious. What is a 1-star monolayer curse and how does it compare to a 4-star tetralayer curse? Ping. A 1-star monolayer curse is a curse with just a single layer of complexity. It is not necessarily more or less complex than a 4-star tetralayer curse, though it is much easier to cure. Lionel frowned. What did it mean by not necessarily more or less complex? What was the point of the divisions, then? A 1-star monolayer curse can only take root in a third-dimensional existence. However, a 4-star tetralayer curse is effective even against a 6th-dimensional existence. Lionel's frown deepened. Aina was dealing with a curse that powerful? What did you mean by Aina's curse was almost as effective as a 4-star tetralayer curse? Ping. A curse's effectiveness is based on 2 factors, its complexity and its level of integration. Aina has a curse with a simple complexity, but an elite growth rate. This allows it to display more strength over time. The more the dictionary spoke, the more Lionel felt it wasn't giving him the answers he wanted. It took a while, but Lionel finally understood what he needed to know. The growth rate of a curse referred to its integration potential. Over time, some curses weakened, but other could grow stronger. Aina's curse, the 9-segmented bloodleech curse, was a simple curse, but its growth rate was frightening. Though weak against adults, if implanted into an infant, the curse would be able to root itself deeply. This would result in a curse no weaker than a 4-star tetralayer curse in effect as the infant grew into adulthood. It could even grow beyond this. Technically, if this was a curse with a poor growth rate, just breaking into the 4th dimension would have been enough to dispel it. But now, if Aina wanted to break this curse without outside assistance, it would take her breaking into the 6th dimension. But by then the curse would have grown even more powerful. Who knows if even breaking into the 7th dimension would be helpful by that point? And, from Lionel's understanding, the greatest known powers in the dimensional verse were only of the 7th dimension, including the Morales family. So, if the curse became any more powerful, it would become next to impossible for Aina to ever think of dispelling it on her own. Can cleansing water dispel this curse? Ping? Yes. What level? Ping? Extended treatment with 5th-dimensional cleansing waters or 1 drop of 6th-dimensional cleansing waters? Will the segmented cube produce 5th and 6th-dimensional cleansing waters? Ping? Yes. Upon reaching the 3rd and 4th phases respectively, Lionel sighed a breath of relief hearing these words. This was perfect, that just meant he had to find a way to upgrade the segmented cube like he had helped it reach the 2nd phase. However, after Lionel had this thought, he froze. In order to upgrade the segmented cube into the 2nd phase, it had required letting it absorb force from an impossibly rare force eruption. If he wanted to upgrade it again, wouldn't he have to find a 5th-dimensional force eruption? And then a 6th-dimensional one? Lionel shuddered. Had he not awakened his metal synergy lineage factor, that force eruption would have killed him. He had no confidence in surviving a 5th-dimensional force eruption, let alone a 6th-dimensional one. And this didn't even mention the problem of finding such force eruptions to begin with. Not only would he have to travel to such worlds, but he would have to find such a rare occurrence as well. Just when Lionel thought this was enough to leave him speechless, he suddenly thought of another problem, leaving his heart in a panic. For now, Aina's curse was only approaching a 4-star tetralayer curse in effect, but it wasn't quite one yet. As such, fifth-dimensional cleansing waters could still work. But for how much longer? How much longer will fifth-dimensional cleansing waters be effective as a cure? Ping, replying to Seed. 639:19:39:08, Lionel sucked in a cold breath. 639 days. That was less than 2 years. Lionel's jaw clenched, gripping his fists tightly. The dictionary said long-term treatment was also necessary if he chose to use fifth-dimensional cleansing waters. He would have even less time than that. Fine. Let's set a limit of 500 days. Within 500 days, I need to enter the fifth dimension and be in position to look for a source to upgrade the segmented cube. Lionel was so lost in his own thoughts that he didn't even notice that Aina had already awoken. Though she noticed she was half naked and in Lionel's arms, she didn't have the reaction one would have thought. Even Lionel would have expected her to jump up and rush away. But noticing the light curtain across her front, Aina couldn't help but smile sweetly. By now, her scars had already faded back to their knife wound-like appearance. In fact, she seemed far stronger than she had been in the past, likely due to the blood she had ingested. And now, she just felt warm. She couldn't help but adjust herself slightly, her back pressing more squarely onto Lionel. Oh? Lionel blinked. Oh! Lionel moved to get up. Since Aina was awake, there was no longer a danger of her drowning, so he didn't have to stay here. Sorry, since you're alright ill. When Lionel was about to leave, he suddenly felt Aina's slender fingers grab his forearm, clamping down tight. Aina hadn't seen Lionel in months. She didn't even need to look back to know who it was. In her time of need, he was there once again. Lionel's eyes widened slightly, but at least he wasn't dense enough to insist. He obediently sat back down and let Aina rest on his lap. Alright. Lionel snapped a finger, causing the silencing arts around Aina's ears to vanish. The two sat in silence for a long while, Aina not relinquishing her grip on Lionel's forearm in the slightest. In fact, she somehow got a hold of his second arm and wrapped them around herself as though a spoiled child. Lionel couldn't help but smile, his heart feeling exceptionally light. You stink. Aina's soft voice stunned Lionel for a while before he broke out into laughter. Why did it seem like this was this girl's favorite thing to say to him? She wasn't exactly wrong though. He hadn't had a bath in months. I stink too, Lionel sputtered with laughter. Even without laying eyes on it, he could see Aina's frowning pout. Stop laughing and wash my back. This time Lionel choked. Chapter 502. Lionel was shocked to the point of speechlessness. Did he really just hear what he thought he did? You don't want to? Aina's soft voice shook Lionel to his core. She had never sounded so fragile to him before, and a part of him thought that the only reason she managed to drum up the courage to say such a thing was because she was facing away from him. Yes, I'll do it. Lionel hurriedly replied. Aina stood from Lionel's lap, still facing away from him. Most of her alluring back view was obstructed by light curtain and her long hair. But Lionel's imagination alone seemed to be capable of spinning him away into a land of fantasy. Aina slowly waded into the deeper waters until her waist was submerged. Her body shifted slightly and Lionel's eyes almost popped out of their sockets when she bent over and stood again with a black fabric in her hand. That's definitely her underwear. Lionel looked toward the ceiling and gulped. Are you coming? Aina's voice sounded even weaker than before. If Lionel didn't know better, he would think that she was still wounded. Shaking his head, Lionel also stood from his seated position. He had already taken off his upper garments, revealing a toned torso, even more toned than he seemed to remember in fact. So all he had to do now was take off his pants. Lionel looked down toward a certain region. Behave, he said sternly. Lionel tossed his pants to the side, slowly walking forward. When Aina sensed that he was close, she shuddered slightly, but she still grabbed at her long hair, pulling it into a ponytail and sweeping it to her front. The action should have completely exposed her back to Lionel, but light curtain obstructed everything. Lionel activated magic touch and grabbed a small towel at the edge of the pool. With the ability of the cleansing waters, soap was completely unnecessary. But Lionel still brought out a few herbs he had found in the underground garden of the hive. He rarely had uses for these herbs, however that didn't mean that they didn't have special abilities of their own. Lionel smiled. Which scent do you like more? This one? Or this one? Aina froze when she realized how close Lionel was. She could feel his warm breath on her neck. It was the sort of feeling that sent goosebumps racing across her body. After a while she finally paid attention to Lionel's words. Lionel's arm stretched around her and raised two different budding flowers to her nose. One had a gentle purple color and dozens of tiny petals clumped together to form its figure. It had a slight spicy scent that tickled the nose almost like a carbonated drink. It reminded Aina of cinnamon. The other was a gentle yellow color, so pale that it almost seemed white at first glance. It only had 3 petals, but each was as large as Aina's palm and flopped about like drooping dog ears. Though Aina's hands weren't particularly big to begin with, such a size on a flower was quite surprising. This flower's scent was far more subtle. It reminded Aina somewhat of lavender, but also of freshly made apple juice. It was hard to pinpoint its exact scent, but it left her feeling intrigued. This one, Aina said softly, pointing to the yellow flower. Lionel nodded. Watch this. The number of mage arts Lionel had learned from Camelot numbered in the hundreds to even thousands. Among them, not all were tailored toward battle. In fact, the vast majority weren't. They rather existed almost as foundational understandings one could build upon. Many of the useless light elemental apprentice arts Lionel learned built the foundation for far more complex arts. But that didn't mean that this was all the useless arts could do. There were many that existed not for the sake of battle, but rather for convenience. There was one water spell that went by the name of Fragrant Touch. It was able to concentrate natural fragrances one found in the wild into a liquid, soapy form. It was a favorite of female water mages, especially when they were out on missions. Of course, this was only because Camelot hadn't exactly invented soap. So they found other methods. Lionel cast Fragrant Touch. At that moment, tendrils of cleansing waters spiraled up from the pool around the two, circling around the yellow flower and grinding it into a paste. That paste soon dissolved into the water and formed a thick white liquid with a hint of yellow. Just a single flower formed over a liter of this viscous liquid. Lionel allowed the blob of thick liquid to hover in the air before dabbing at the towel. Stealing his will, he approached Aina's back. Wait. Aina suddenly spoke out. Ichem? Lionel paused, his heart filled with half relief and half unwillingness. But Aina's next words almost made his vision go black. Shouldn't you remove this light spell first? How are you going to help me if you can't see what you're doing? Lionel coughed. Suddenly he felt a little lightheaded. Yes, right, I should. Lionel dug deep and caused light curtain to vanish. But no matter how he prepared himself, he still wasn't ready. The first thing he noticed was Aina's alluring silhouette. Her slender shoulders, the curve of her torso to the hips, the toned strength of her back. Lionel gulped. Though the water submerged her waist down without the lights of light curtain, and with how crystal clear the cleansing waters were, Lionel could faintly see a distorted image that made any sort of lower body self-control he had fly out the window. Thoughts of what Aina's front view might look like took hold of his mind. Calm down. Breathe. Lionel slowly raised his hand, dabbing the towel in the yellowish liquid and reaching for Aina's back once again. When the towel met Aina's back, Lionel could almost feel the suppleness through the fabric. He gently scrubbed across her skin, watching as a soapy whiteness began to slowly form. Can you wash my hair too? Lionel nodded silently. At least this was much less stimulating. He could do that much, right? Soon, Lionel felt that he had regained his calm. Rather than feeling anxious, he began to enjoy the process. The silky smoothness of Aina's skin and hair gliding across his fingers was therapeutic. Chapter 503. I like this smell. What is this flower called? Aina asked. Aina closed her eyes, a calm smile on her face as Lionel shampooed her hair. The gentle smell of apple and lavender made her feel at peace. It's called an infant sun lily. Infant? Lionel nodded. If I hadn't harvested it so soon, it would have produced a fruit at maturity that had the effect of clearing the mind and amplifying fire affinity. Though the rise in affinity is only large for the first few minutes, after that it begins to dwindle. If you wanted lasting effects, you have to consume the fruits over a long period of time. Lionel scratched the back of his head a bit awkwardly. He didn't know much about herbs, so he hadn't known at the time that he interrupted the sun lily's growth process. In fact, much of the reason its yellow color was so pale was precisely because it was still an infant. Oh, I see. I like the smell, she said softly. In that case, I can start planting them in the garden so we can have more. The abode setting was just like any other luxurious home. It had several rooms, a large bathhouse, and also had a garden. That said, Lionel didn't visit the garden very often at all. He thought of using it as a training space as there was ample room. But his training was much more efficient if it took place in his dream world. So there truly wasn't much of a point. Okay. Lionel's heart warmed when he heard the slight tinge of happiness in Aina's voice. Even though he couldn't see her smile, he knew it was there and that was all that mattered. Lionel covered the length of Aina's hair in the fragrant liquid. Then began to slowly wash it out, a tinge of seriousness on his face. If others saw him now, they would definitely feel that he was taking this task much too seriously. Your hair's gotten longer, Lionel commented offhandedly. Aina's hair was much longer than what he remembered. Considering the growth rate of hair, it shouldn't have been possible for such an exaggerated change to occur in just a few months. Somehow, Aina's hair had gone from barely reaching the small of her back to reach past her ankles. If she walked around like this, her hair would definitely drag across the ground. What Lionel didn't know, of course, was that this had been caused by Aina's transformation. Though the rest of her body had gone back to how it once had been, her hair didn't shorten, unfortunately. Now that Lionel thought about it, long hair was quite uncharacteristic for a woman like Aina. With her level of practicality, even down to her military uniform and boxer briefs, Lionel wouldn't have been surprised if she appeared before him completely bald one day. But, interestingly enough, she never did. In fact, back when Lionel first met Aina, her hair had been exceptionally short, no longer than Jessica's. But, after their freshman year, during their sophomore year if he recalled correctly, she began to let it grow out. Not that he minded. He quite preferred long hair. He thought it made her look particularly fairy-like. Aina blinked at Lionel's words. You don't like it? Lionel was stunned before hurriedly shaking his head. No, I like your long hair. It just might be slightly inconvenient for you. Aina smiled. It was a shame that Lionel couldn't see it, the slight blushing of her cheeks, the hint of pride in her eye, the gentle slope of her pink lips. I know you do. Aina spoke in words that were barely audible over the moving water. Nothing? Lionel raised his brow in confusion. He didn't understand what Aina meant by that. At that moment, Lionel washed the last of the soapy bubbles from Aina's hair. The light fragrance of apple coming from her made him feel at ease. He even forgot about his previous confusion. All done, he said proudly. Okay, turn around, Aina said with her usual soft tone. Lionel nodded like an obedient child and did as he was told. It wasn't long after he did so that Lionel felt a pair of small hands on his back. The feeling was so novel that he didn't know how to react. Aina's actions were just as slow and meticulous as Lionel's, but her face was flushed red with embarrassment from start to finish. It wasn't just because she felt that following the outlines of Lionel's muscular back left her feeling warmth in ways she never had before, but it was also because Lionel was much taller than she was. So, while the water covered her waist quite easily, it couldn't do the same for him. Lionel seemed to realize this after a while too, but he was too embarrassed to say anything about it. He never thought that he would have such a day. Finished. When Lionel heard these words that were no louder than the flapping of a butterfly's wings, he wanted to run away at that moment as quickly as he could. How embarrassing. He wasn't one who cared very much about such things. He had appeared naked in a locker room more than once in his life. However, doing it in front of Aina left him feeling flustered. He felt even more embarrassed than Aina herself. All that comfort he had felt disappeared. However, just when Lionel wanted to run away, he found two arms wrapped around his waist. At that moment, it felt like a bolt of electricity had shot through his body. It wasn't because of the arms, but rather because a softness he had never experienced before was now firmly pressed against his back. Two perfectly molded, soft mounds of flesh pressed flush against him. Lionel's mind went blank. All the computational power in the world was at his fingertips, yet he suddenly short-circuited. Whatever control he had over his lower half vanished. It pierced through the water as though it was a spear itself, standing at attention. Lionel was so lost that he didn't even notice when a slender hand reached toward it. Chapter 504. Lionel froze, his entire body tensing. He felt a hand grab onto him below, but he didn't even have the courage to look down. Aina? Lionel's voice came out exceptionally hoarse. It bordered on the growl of a beast, just the sound alone made Aina shudder, her hold on Lionel's waist becoming tighter. Lionel tried to pull away, but Aina's strength was far beyond his own. One of her arms wrapped around his waist like a vice grip while the other reached out a hand and found a place on his heated shaft. The temperature of Lionel's body seemed to skyrocket, a fog beginning to emit from his reddening skin. Compared to the grip around his waist, her hand was exceptionally gentle. Though she hardly moved, it made Lionel's knees weak. He didn't think that there could be such a marvelous feeling in the world. But something was eating at the back of his mind. Unfortunately, he didn't get the chance to think about it. Lionel felt his body being pushed forward. Before he could realize what was happening, he found himself at the edge of the pool and being spun around. At this point he truly wanted to shed tears. Why did he feel more like a rag doll than a man? How was she so much stronger than him? Lionel's metal body had entered the perfection realm now thanks to the herb essence he found within Camelot's vaults. Soon afterward, his body naturally progressed to the fourth dimension. Yet he was still so much weaker than Aina. Of course, this was likely because metal body focused more on defense rather than strength and it could only exhibit a portion of its ability without Lionel activating his runes. But it was still a shocking feat nonetheless. Lionel's back was pressed against the side of the pool before being pressed down into a seated position. He hardly caught a glimpse of Aina before she straddled him. With Aina grasping a hold of such a sensitive part of him, Lionel couldn't resist even if he wanted to. But he panicked when he realized what Aina was doing. Lionel felt the tip of his rod suddenly press against soft flesh that separated out into folds. He felt like such a fool. It hadn't even entered yet, but he realized that calling just a hand the best feeling was nothing more than pure ignorance. If there was anything that could possibly feel better than this, it must only exist in a world of gods. However, it was this very intoxicating feeling that made Lionel's panic reach a fever pitch. Judging by Aina's position straddling over him like this, he didn't need to guess what this feeling was. Even as a virgin he would be too much of a fool to not understand. From Lionel's vantage point, all he could see was a wall of wet hair blocking Aina's face as she looked down as though fiddling with something. Her movements were awkward and erratic, her every action carrying a clearly discernible trembling. She had gone from a highly coordinated athlete to what looked like a person who couldn't even tie her own shoes. Lionel could hear a slight whimpering coming from Aina as though she was trying to hold back and ignore pain she was suffering through. But a barrier seemed to stop her from going any further. So she tried harder, trying to force her body down. As she did so, the sharp pain she was feeling seemingly only became worse. At that moment, Lionel finally regained his strength, the haziness in his gaze vanishing. That uncomfortable feeling at the back of his head, that very thing he had ignored until now came bubbling forth. All of this felt wrong. No, it was wrong. Aina. The roar caused the abode setting to tremble, even the waters parted beneath Lionel's shout. Violent ripples spread, sending a wave of cleansing water surging out. The hair that covered Aina's face parted beneath the forcefulness of Lionel's shout. For the first time since they entered this pool together, Lionel's gaze landed on Aina's face. But what he saw left him heartbroken. Tears streamed down her cheeks, her eyes swollen with redness. Lionel felt like such a fool. Aina's boldness, her asking him to wash her back, to remove the light curtain, even down to trying to wash his back as well. Were those really things she wanted to do? He was an idiot. Blinded by his own lust, he just nodded like a pecking chicken, following along as though he could no longer think with his head. Because he wanted it so much for it to be her words, her feelings, he ignored everything else and went with the flow, disregarding how ridiculous it all was. Aina. Lionel gently grasped Aina's face, his heart trembling with guilt. Aina hiccuped, wiping her tears away as fast as she could. I'm sorry. Aina sobbed. She felt so stupid. She was almost there but she just had to start crying. Just one more push and she would have broken through. Don't leave me again. They'll do it, I can do it. Lionel's gaze reddened. His arms wrapped around Aina, his hand caressing the back of her head. He held her firmly against his chest, his jaw clenched. He didn't expect that leaving Aina for a few months would have such an effect. He had only wanted to give her some space to sort out her emotions, but he hadn't thought this would be the result. How could he not feel guilty? As though a wall had broken down between them, Aina broke out into a fit of sobs. Her hands balled into fists that rested on Lionel's chest. She tried to bury her head in the same place, her emotions spilling over. She never said it but she had felt afraid. She was afraid that Lionel wouldn't come back. Afraid that he really would abandon her. And the worst part was that it would all be her fault, all because she couldn't open her mouth to speak, all because she couldn't communicate how she felt. All she could think of during these past few months were Lionel's words, how he could grow apart from her if she pushed him away. It was her fault, she had done exactly that. She felt she had to do something to make him stay. She had to. But she never understood why Lionel liked her to begin with. She didn't feel like she was special, she didn't think she had anything else to give. This was the only thing she could think of. I won't leave you again. Lionel's voice rumbled, the vibrations flowing through his chest. Aina could feel every word, every syllable, every ounce of will backing them. Aina collapsed onto Lionel completely, letting him support the entirety of her weight. Her tears spilled forth in a flood. They fell down Lionel's chest in a torrent, only to be washed away by the cleansing waters. Chapter 505. Lionel held on to Aina for a long while. He lost track of time, but if he was truly paying attention, it was easily over an hour before Aina's tears slowed to a crawl. However, from start to finish he didn't say a word. He only held her in his arms, a protective aura manifesting around him. At that moment he didn't care who it was who stood before him, he wouldn't allow a single hair on her to be harmed. When Aina's tears stopped, she fell into a deep sleep. Without a care in the world, her cheek rested against Lionel's beating heart, its steady rhythm lulling her into a world of dreams. City Lord Kiefer sat at his desk, a blank look on his face as he gazed at the dim fire lamp before him. There were countless methods of keeping tabs on one's life and death in the dimensional verse. Since City Lord White was such an important piece of Terrain's invasion, it was no surprise that the cities would invest in monitoring her situation. Though City Lord Kiefer had expected to deal with casualties in this war, maybe the last person he had expected to lose was City Lord White. His heart couldn't help but swim with a torrent of emotions. His hand reached out, grasping the dying flame and allowing it to dance in his palm. Despite the fact it was a fire, it held no warmth. In fact, it was quite cold. Taking a deep breath, City Lord Kiefer squeezed his palm into a fist, shattering what remained of the flame. He closed his eyes, images of what happened during City Lord White's final moments playing in his mind. He had originally paid the ridiculous expense needed for this feature so that he could be aware of any powerful enemies their scouting reports might have missed out on. But now, this had little to do with strategy and reconnaissance. He needed to see who had killed her. After a long while, City Lord Kiefer unclenched his fists, his eyes opening. His gaze held a slight hint of red within them that slowly dissipated. At that moment, Anred walked into his father's office. His gaze swept across the 12 fire lamps on his father's desk before he focused on the one that had been extinguished. His eyes narrowed. He knew his father well. Despite the fact that he and City Lord White hadn't had any relations since that fateful night so many rumors had been spread about, his father hadn't forgotten about her. Camelot should have been the easiest target. It was a place without foundations and with a people who had yet to awaken to their abilities. Even Anared had made his displeasure known for his father's decision back then. City Lord White was most definitely within the top 4 in terms of fighting prowess amongst the city lords. Even if she wasn't tasked with attacking the capital, she should have, at the very least, been assigned to either White Angel or Royal Blue Province, considering these were the 2nd and 3rd ranked provinces of Earth. Yet, because his father wanted to protect her, she was sent to Camelot. And somehow, she died in a place that should have been the safest? Anared didn't feel any particular affection for City Lord White. No, it was more accurate to say that he wouldn't lay his life on the line for her. But he also wouldn't stand idly by if her life was in danger. For anyone who knew his personality, this would be quite shocking. Anared was overly protective of all those he saw as his own, but he wouldn't even raise a finger to aid those he had no relation to. The fact that he would help City Lord White at all spoke volumes. But how could he not? He knew well that Ree was his half-sister and that City Lord White was her mother. Ree thought that she was an orphan, but that was only because the little girl was just too simple. Why would a family like the Kiefer family treat a mere orphan so well? She lived the pampered life of a princess and in complete oblivion. Who killed her? Anared asked coldly. Anared's father remained silent for a long while, the beating of his heart becoming slower with each passing moment. Eventually, it regained its former calm. Aina Brazinger. Anared's pupils constricted when he heard these words. He thought that any expert that managed to kill her would have been an unknown. He had only asked as a formality, expecting a description rather than a name. Even if he did prepare himself to hear a name, this was the very last name he had expected to. He knew the name Aina Brazinger well since that girl had managed to do something he trained for over a decade to do without lifting a single finger. That said, Aina couldn't even defeat Jilnia. How could she possibly stand a chance against City Lord White? Was that some sort of joke? Could you have seen wrongly? No. City Lord Kiefer responded blandly. However, she seemed to have used some double-edged technique that left her incapacitated. We have no way of knowing how often she can use it or even if she would dare to use it again. Hearing this, Anared finally understood somewhat. So, it was a berserk-type ability. Berserk abilities weren't too rare. Those who had strength-based abilities like Aina's would often awaken them as they continued to evolve. It was a natural progression. Often, added strength was related to tapping into more of the Bodhi's potential, so berserk skills were the next natural step. Of course, Anared only thought this because he had no idea that Aina's ability wasn't a strength-based ability, but rather a healing-based one. Should I lead a troop to Camelot then? Such a skill wouldn't be able to be activated twice in quick succession. This is a good opportunity. City Lord Kiefer stood, his visage expressionless. No. City Lord Hargrove is already in position and everything is prepared. We need to be swift and strike fast, giving them no opportunity to counter. Go support him. Anared nodded and left, a killing intent hidden deep within his eyes. Ree might not know that City Lord White was her mother, but there was only so long the little girl could remain so naive. Since they actually dared to harm his little sister like this, Anared would make them repay this debt in blood. He wondered what Earth would do when tens of thousands of criminals from its own dark cloud prison were suddenly released. Chapter 506. Aina shifted in Lionel's arms. When she realized where she was, she began to blush profusely. But as much as she wanted to run away, she didn't dare to at this point. She really regretted throwing all her clothes away now. And why was this damn water so clear? Lionel's chuckling awoke Aina from her own thoughts. By now, her entire body had turned into a deep shade of red. Unfortunately, the only place she had to hide was Lionel's chest. Oh, don't squirm so much. Though Lionel was laughing at Aina, he too wanted to shed tears. Didn't this girl realize where she was sitting? He had displayed enough willpower for a lifetime today. Aina blinked, peeking up from Lionel's chest. A bright smile spread across her lips, her embarrassment suddenly vanishing. It's not like this is the first time I've seen it. Lionel almost choked on air again. That wasn't me. Lionel defended himself. It wasn't his fault. It really wasn't. Back then, the primitive man had had control over his body. Damn, by now, he had already forgotten about that embarrassing moment, only for Aina to bring it up again. He felt as though he had suffered a lethal combo. Aina giggled. Only she knew that that wasn't what she was referring to. But, if Lionel knew that she was referring to a certain event that happened in the Jones Zone, it was unknown how he would react. Lionel was unconscious back then, so he had no way of knowing what happened. And even if he had been conscious at this very moment, he was suddenly very much aware of two soft mounds pressed against his chest. So, he couldn't quite focus on anything else. I'm sorry. Aina's sudden words caught Lionel off guard. The lewd thoughts he had vanished like the wind soon afterward. Lionel brought a hand to Aina's cheek, forcing her to look at him. You have nothing to apologize for. He said seriously. In fact, I'm sorry. I was so focused on other things that I didn't even realize so much time had passed. Lionel didn't think that Aina would think he had abandoned her. Back then, he purposely left the segmented cube with Aina as a sign of exactly that. He had only taken the segmented cube with him before he left to the Demon Empire. But things hadn't worked out as he had expected. Lionel was a person who could break things down into their simple details and analyze them logically. If he was in Aina's place, he would have seen through the fact he left behind the segmented cube as a good sign. But that didn't mean that Aina herself would see it as such. In fact, when he thought about it, Aina could have easily seen the segmented cube as a sign of pity. After all, it had the only cure to her scars within it. So who knew how she really saw such an action? Aina furiously shook her head at Lionel's words. I'm the one who pushed you away. I couldn't even answer a simple question. When Aina thought back to it, even she couldn't quite explain why she had dodged Lionel's questions like that. He had only been worried about her. Though back then she had only tried to downplay things to reassure him, the more she thought about it, the more guilty she felt. She had wanted to say she was fine and that she had made it out alive, so it wasn't a big deal. But her words had come off like Lionel shouldn't care so much. When a stranger or an acquaintance asked you how your day went, most would give a perfunctory answer even if your day really had been terrible. Only when in the presence of those you truly trusted would you give a real answer. Aina's words back then had practically treated Lionel as though he was an acquaintance she was sharing a few words with rather than a man she could give her heart to. It was no wonder Lionel had chosen to pull away at that moment. Lionel shook his head and smiled, gently stroking Aina's cheek. Forget it. It's not a big deal. No. Aina shook her head again. It is a big deal. Aina took a deep breath and began to speak. She didn't allow Lionel to cut her off or say that it was fine again. She knew that Lionel cared too much about her. If she really allowed him to say that it was fine, he would simply never ask about such sensitive topics again. From observing Lionel for so long, she had realized that he was simply too good at separating his emotions from his logic. And he almost always let logic dictate his actions first and foremost. She didn't want such an artificial barrier to exist between them because even if she hadn't said it in but so many words, she too cared about Lionel. In fact, she had cared about him for a long time already. So she spoke. She began with what happened when she was randomly teleported to a wasteland of terrain, to how she ran into the variant zone, to her run-in with the heirs and heiress of the three powers. She told Lionel about how she had escaped them, and then she began to describe how she ran into the mountain sands range and about how she entered the maze of tunnels. When she got to the appearance of the puppet master, her body began to involuntarily tremble once again. But this time within Lionel's arms she gained the strength to speak. She looked into Lionel's eyes from start to finish, finding a steady calm within their fathomless depths. She watched as a spark of rage lit within them and observed as it boiled over like a frightening eruption of magma. Anyone else, beneath such pressure, would feel as though their souls were being crushed and that their hearts could no longer beat. But Aina hadn't felt so comfortable in her life. Watching Lionel become infuriated for her sake made her heart beat wildly and filled her stomach with butterflies. By now, Lionel's rage had superseded his lust, so his member was no longer at attention. But it was now Aina's turn to feel a fire light her lower belly. She felt that Lionel was exceptionally attractive when he was leading men like he had his teammates just a couple months ago. But now she found it hard to decide which version of him she liked more. The leader version? Or this protective version? Her thighs couldn't help but squeeze down slightly on either side of Lionel's hips. She had a feeling that if she tried to break past that certain barrier now, it would be much easier and not nearly as painful. Chapter 507. Lionel had no idea that Aina had been lit afire. If it wasn't because he wanted to listen to the story to the end and didn't want to leave Aina at this moment, he might have charged off to earn another talisman to terrain. To dare have designs on his Aina. If he ever ran into this so-called puppet master, Lionel would be certain to rip him to shreds. Aina paused, her amber eyes scanning Lionel's face as though she wanted to memorize every line and slope. She always knew that Lionel was quite handsome. His tan skin, his pale green eyes, his strong jaw. She had to admit that she missed his messy dirty blonde hair. But this long bronze hair made him look particularly masculine, almost like a Roman god, especially when it was paired with his broad shoulders and chest. It was only at this moment that she realized that she had never observed Lionel so closely before. She had always been too shy to do so in the past. But now she felt many times more comfortable doing so, especially since Lionel's mind was hardly focused on her actions at the moment. He hung on her every word instead as though trying to visualize the day he would kill this puppet master. How did you escape? Lionel's sudden question shook Aina out of her fantasy land. She blushed slightly, but noticing that Lionel hadn't found anything odd about her actions, she continued. I never expected for my curse to help me in such a way. Aina started again. I usually use its suppressive effects to help with my training, but I didn't expect for my blood to carry the same effect. After it consumed my blood, it became severely weakened and the restrictions on me lessened. I wanted to kill it right then and there, but it began to summon more of its guards. Back then I entered a weird state. I'm not sure how to describe it, but I've never felt so powerful before. The restrictions on my mind seemed to loosen and I could feel his other puppets coming, but these puppets were completely unlike the uncoordinated ones he used to mine in the mountains. In fact, some of them had consciousnesses of their own and were exceptionally powerful. Most had strength at tier 7 and above. Also, though he was weakened, he was still half a step into the 5th dimension. It was fine if he spent all his strength suppressing the curse. In that case he wouldn't be able to move. But if I forced him to attack, I was sure that he could still kill me. So, taking advantage of my strengthened state, I stole the capsule he wanted to imprison me in and ran away. It's hard for me to remember much about what happened after that. It's all so hazy. Aina frowned, her delicate brow wrinkling. Though she seemed to have knife wounds across her face, Lionel found her current appearance quite adorable. Or rather, he would have had he not been so pissed. Wait, your strengthened state? Is that part of your ability? Lionel asked curiously. Aina hesitated. though she said she didn't know how she got to that strengthened state. She hadn't told the whole truth. She had a vague idea. It was just that. Her face was already scarred. If Lionel knew that she drank blood, would he really not want her anymore? How could he want to be with such a gross woman? How was she any different from the variant invalid who had eaten all those people? In fact, if it wasn't for him, she wouldn't have been able to enter such a strengthened state because the blood she got was precisely from those desecrated corpses. Aina opened her mouth but hesitated again. "Oh, I can't not answer again." Aina grit her teeth. Lionel blinked curiously, waiting with patience. The blood from the human carcasses the puppet master had spread across the table. I ingested it. Aina's words seemed to take all the strength out of her. She felt like she was going to collapse that very moment. Her voice was as soft as could be, almost beneath what a human could possibly pick up with their ears. "What?" Lionel responded. Hearing this, Aina paled considerably, her eyes breaking away from Lionel's as she looked down. Her breathing hitched, she was almost on the verge of another panic attack. What would she do now? But Lionel's next words left her stunned. "That's so cool." Aina looked up somewhat weakly at a loss for words. "Just imagine it, if I told the guys that my girlfriend was a vampire, they would die from envy, don't you think?" Lionel grinned wildly, his face carrying with it a naive, boyish charm. It was hard to believe that this was the same man who struck so much fear on the battlefield. At that moment, he was far more like the boy who said Shield Cross Stars had a cool uniform rather than the man who reaped lives with a single thought. As for thinking Aina was gross, Lionel had never had such thoughts. He so easily accepted the little mink's darkness affinity, why would he care about drinking blood? Though current technology was far beyond it, he had even read about how their ancestors used to use blood transfusions to save the sick and injured. How was that much different from ingesting blood? Lionel at least didn't see much of a difference. All he had thoughts of was having a cool vampire girlfriend. That would definitely give him points to show off to the boys. He couldn't help but grin like a little boy. And because he was so busy grinning, he couldn't react before Aina shifted upward, her lips planting firmly against his. Aina's palms held Lionel's face in place as though she was scared he would run away. At that moment she only wanted to kiss him so deeply that the memory was engraved onto her mind. Lionel was stunned for a moment, but a heat in his chest tossed such thoughts out of his mind. He wrapped his arms around Aina's waist as her hands traveled to the back of his head. The two embraced one another, their lips locked. Aina shivered when she felt Lionel's tongue invade her mouth, but she didn't resist. It felt like a warm liquid was filling her body, her mind entering a state of euphoria it had never tasted before. Chapter 508. Aina sunk her fingers into the heavy threads of Lionel's hair. She had never experienced such an intoxicating feeling before. When Lionel shamelessly stole her first kiss, her heart had fluttered and her mind had grown foggy. But that moment had been filled with innocence and purity. It was the kind of memory that filled one with sweetness. But at this moment, Aina didn't feel sweetness. She felt heat, as though her entire body was burning up from the inside out. However, rather than wanting to separate from Lionel, she only wanted to get closer. Lionel could feel the same heat. And maybe, in some way, it was even more potent for him. Aina might have been petite, but her chest had volume that left him at a loss for words. Her face might have been scarred, but he couldn't find a single other flaw on her body. Everything from her touch, to her breath, to the silky smoothness of her skin left him in a daze. Lionel's hands slipped down from her waist, grasping the underside of Aina's thighs and lifting her up. Aina gasped slightly from the sudden change, subconsciously causing her arms and legs to wrap around Lionel tighter. With the strength she used, maybe if it wasn't for the fact Lionel had a metal body, his bones would have been crushed. Being risen into the sky, Aina felt one part helpless and another part elated. She loved the feeling of Lionel sweeping her off her feet, the feeling of him bearing her weight in his strong arms. Lionel gently placed Aina down at the side of the pool. From this position, all he could imagine was thrusting into her with all his might. The instinct was so potent that his body trembled, his cock pulsing as though a beast struggling against its chain. Aina could feel Lionel pressing against her below. Her mind was somewhat hazy, feeling just as intoxicated as Lionel's own. She could feel a wetness spreading that had little to do with the pool of water they had just been in. She had a mind to let Lionel do as he pleased. No, she wanted him to do as he pleased. It was a completely different feeling from before. Whereas previously she felt like she had to, now, she wanted to. But Somewhere deep inside she didn't quite feel ready yet. It wasn't because she didn't trust Lionel, nor was it because she didn't have feelings for him. She just felt that things were moving too fast. It left her at a loss. She separated from Lionel's kiss, pressing her forehead against his. Her hands held onto his cheeks as he held onto her hips. Her thighs trembled against Lionel's sides when she felt his heated shaft pressing against her below. Aina reached a hand down from Lionel's face and began to slowly stroke him, her movements gentle and caring. Lionel's breathing hitched, his gaze carrying a tinge of red as it locked onto Aina's. He could see the affection within those amber irises. Though her movements were slightly awkward and unrefined, just the fact she was willing to try left his heart feeling warm. "Look at me," Aina said softly, her words tickling Lionel's eardrums. As a 5-star health professional, Aina was more familiar with the human body and its psychology than most. The same way she knew that it would be dangerous if Lionel's lower region wasn't cleaned was the same way she knew that men were visual creatures. Even if she couldn't give everything to Lionel at this moment, she still wanted him to know that she was his. Lionel's breathing quickened, his eyes hesitating somewhat before leaving Aina's gaze and traveling downward. The feeling of her hands slowly moving up and down seemed to intensify, his body heating up like flamed coals. All this time he had been subconsciously avoiding looking at Aina's body. It was one part due to respect and another part due to him not wanting her to think he hated the sight of her face. But hearing her ask him to do it so blatantly left his mouth dry. At that moment, Lionel stood at the edge of the pool, Aina seated at its ledge, her legs wrapped around his hips. Their foreheads were lightly pressed against one another, giving Lionel a vantage point that almost made his nose bleed. Aina leaned back slightly, her hand motions never slowing. She invited him to gaze at her body, a gentle red blush dancing across her skin. The first thing Lionel saw was Aina's toned belly, glistening with wetness. With her half-seated position, it flexed beneath the lights of the bathhouse and the shadow of his head. With Aina's every breath, her abs constricted, showing off the faint outline of a powerful physique. Lionel felt as though he could watch her breathe like this indefinitely. "Move my hair," Aina whispered. Lionel gulped. Aina's hair draped over her shoulders, blocking much of the view of her chest. All Lionel could see were 2 rounded protrusions. With slow movements, Lionel brought a hand up, sliding it underneath Aina's hair from her shoulder and moving it away. Aina's blush became more furious, the redness of her skin only making her more alluring. Lionel could see the rapid beating of her heart through her skin. Every pulse made her chest move just a bit, leaving him at a loss for words. He had never seen something so beautiful in his life. He had been feeling it against his chest all this time, but this was the first time he truly knew how gorgeous the sight could be. Even with how large his hands were, he didn't believe he could cover them completely. The healthy drop, the alluring pink dots, the perkiness of youth. It left him not knowing how to breathe. It was perfect. "Touch me." As though too embarrassed to look Lionel in the eye when she said this, Aina dove into another kiss, her hand movements increasing just the slightest bit. Her movement caused Lionel's hand, which had been hovering after moving her hair, to land directly onto her chest. The supple silkiness of her skin sent Lionel into cloud 9. He couldn't hold back anymore. Aina felt the pulsing of the raging beast in her hand grow past a point of no return. But this time she didn't try to avoid what came out. She focused entirely on their kiss, a deep happiness blooming in her heart. Chapter 509. Lionel's sharp intake of breath slowly calmed, his emotions sitting on a cloud high above. He didn't believe that there could be a greater happiness in the world. It wasn't just about the feeling itself, but rather about the fact the woman he liked so much had been by his side during it. "You didn't have to do that." Lionel's voice carried an edgy gruff to it. Maybe it would still take him a while longer to recover completely. "No, I didn't have to," Aina said with a sweet smile. "I wanted to." Lionel smiled beside himself. "Looks like we need another bath," Lionel said playfully before hoisting Aina up again. She giggled lightly, letting Lionel do as he pleased. While the couple were in their own little world, they had no idea about the goings-on outside. Though the segmented cube had been left right in the middle of a battlefield, no one dared to disturb it. Was that a joke? With how wrathful Lionel had been despite the fact no one had actually laid a finger on Aina, how would he react if they tried to interfere in his matters now? By now, though, the battlefield had been cleared and the dead had been dumped in a pile to be burned. Or rather, Arthur had tried to do this, only to realize there was no chance of burning the corpses of fourth-dimensional entities with normal flames. Without a choice, he had to call upon one of Camelot's 3-star magi to do the job. The last thing they could afford now was some sort of diseased outbreak. Arthur didn't know if the fourth dimension still had plagues, but what he did know was that if they did, they would be far beyond what a disease of the third dimension could compare to. There was no need to take such a risk. It was during these moments that the others finally learned of what happened at the Demon Empire. He did what? King Arthur stood in a daze, looking toward Krakos as though he was examining a mentally ill patient. He wasn't very fond of demons to begin with, so he was hesitant to believe their words in any situation, let alone this one. Krakos looked down toward Arthur, his gaze indifferent and his demeanor carrying the very same scholarly air. He didn't understand the rhetorical question culture of humans. In fact, he didn't understand their sarcasm either. He knew well that Arthur had already heard what he said, so there was absolutely no need for him to repeat himself. Stop. Mordred put out a hand, stopping the situation from reaching a point of escalation. Is what you said true, Krakos? Krakos nodded seriously. Yes, Your Majesty. He helped us to eradicate the entire army. The ones we tried to capture killed themselves, so now there's no one left. There should only be the normal citizens of White City left. Before he left, Lionel suggested that we mobilize an army to capture it. Capture White City? Mordred fell into her thoughts. It was indeed not a good idea to leave a city filled with citizens of another world unconquered. Also, there was always the chance of others coming to take it over. If that happened, then Camelot would be thrust right back into the same situation. Mordred looked toward her father and they both nodded. They were both aware that Lionel's suggestion was the smartest. It was really inadvisable to leave a city unchecked in their territory like this. All right, we will. Arthur's words paused, his gaze narrowing. At the moment, the three of them, Arthur, Mordred and Krakos, were within a military tent on the very same battlefield city Lord White had fallen on. It had been about 2 days since Noah and his troop left. Of course, Arthur didn't blame them for leaving. After the ass-whooping Lionel gave them, he wouldn't have had the face to stay either. But to think they would come back. From the looks of it, it seemed that Noah had semi-recovered while Niall was nowhere to be seen. In truth, Lionel was quite lenient with Niall at the time. He could have blasted a hole through his heart, but he gave the junior governor Duke a chance at life. Whether he seized it or not seemed to remain to be seen. Noah led the troop, his face pale. It was clear that he was still heavily injured. Yet, if it wasn't for the natural reaction of his skin tone, it would be impossible to tell from his facial expressions. Noah swept a glance over the battlefield. Seeing that the segmented cube was still in the same place it had been before, his gaze flashed with an imperceptible light, but he didn't say anything until he made his way to Arthur's tent riding upon the back of another black wolf. With a leap, Noah descended from the back of the wolf as Arthur, Mordred and Krakos exited the tent. Without mincing his words, Noah spoke. White City has been captured and I've stationed half of my army to keep the order. I will need to return to Earth to report this to my imperial grandfather. Before I do, we have yet to begin our negotiations. Mordred and Arthur's expressions became serious. Even if most of White City's main forces had already died, capturing a city was no laughing matter, especially not in such a heavily injured state. Yet Noah had done it. It was impossible for Terrain to not have made contingency plans to protect their cities. So, how had he done it exactly? But, even beyond this, in all the chaos, they had almost forgotten that there were negotiations that had yet to be completed. Let alone completed, they hadn't even begun. Before, they had been reliant on Lionel, but now that they knew that Lionel was actually a prince of this royal family, could they still count on him the same? At that moment, the segmented cube which had remained immobile for the past several days suddenly moved. 2 figures walking hand in hand appeared out of it. One was a smiling young man and the other was a young girl wearing a mask. Despite the fact they were only leisurely walking and idly chatting with one another, the world's energy seemed to revolve around them. Chapter 5:10. Lionel pocketed the segmented cube and seemed to finally realize that the atmosphere was a bit off. He swept a gaze forward and noticed Noah. After a brief pause, he turned back to Aina. Are you sure that it's comfortable? Aina giggled. This was the 4th or 5th time Lionel had asked this question. Yes, really, it is. She lightly touched the mask on her face, a light smile blooming beneath. She normally wouldn't wear a mask, but the purpose of this one wasn't to hide her appearance. After learning about Aina's curse and the time limit, Lionel found out that there was a way to delay the progress of the curse. It was obvious that it was greatly suppressed by cleansing waters, so Lionel chose to craft a mask for Aina that could help her. What he hadn't expected, though, was for Aina to like the mask so much. Though she never said anything, the curse placed her in a perpetual state of discomfort. Even in its least inflamed form, where her scars appeared no different from knife wounds, there was an uncomfortable tightness and itchiness she always had to deal with. But for the first time she felt completely at ease. If she didn't know better, she would have thought that Lionel had cured her completely. The mask itself was something that Lionel put his heart and soul into. It was actually the reason they had taken an extra 2 days to exit the segmented cube, other than celebrating Aina's birthday, of course. The mask used the pearl of the purifying fog clam as a base. It gave the mask itself a premium white glow that seemed somewhat like marble but carried the off-whiteness and milky texture of pearls. The inner workings of the mask were forged with the ice vein type or misty dream Oregon. The purifying fog clam was known for its ability to turn large amounts of water into a gentle mist that almost appeared like fog. As for the mist dream ice vein it was known for its ability to keep its ice-like state even in the hottest of climates, almost as though it was in its own dream world regardless of the environment. Lionel crafted veins patterns throughout the mask with the misty dream and filled its innards with cleansing waters. The combination of the two allowed Aina to have a fine mist of cleansing water perpetually hovering around her face. Any unease she had completely vanished. In the end, the mask gained the appearance of a beautiful piece of art. The contrast of the milky whiteness to the sharp blue lines of the misty dream made it look particularly dazzling. In fact, even Aina hadn't expected to like it so much. What she was more shocked about, though, was the fact that Lionel actually managed to give it defensive strength rivaling a Tier 8 black treasure despite the fact it wasn't designed with such a thing in mind. Others might not know how valuable force crafters were, but how could Aina not be aware? The realization that Lionel hadn't been joking before left her quite stunned. Of course, she hadn't thought that Lionel had been lying. He wasn't that type of person. Rather, she was more shocked by Lionel's level of skill. From what she understood, he was almost at the standard of a fifth-dimensional force crafter. At his age, at least in worlds as weak as theirs. That was completely unheard of. Mordred smiled bitterly when she saw how the two were still somehow in their own world. Didn't they see the gravity of the situation? Mordred cleared her throat. All right. Lionel looked up toward Mordred and grinned. Sorry, I heard that there were negotiations happening now. I've already promised M to take the helm in these matters, so if you want to negotiate, you'll be doing so with me. Hearing these words, Mordred couldn't help but smile. It seemed that she had thought too much before. That was right, if he was willing to beat this cousin of his so savagely, there shouldn't have been anything to worry about to begin with. Jessica, who had descended to Noah's side, frowned when she heard these words. As the Prince of the Empire, something like Lionel negotiating on behalf of outsiders was highly inappropriate. She wanted to open her mouth to say something, but Noah stretched out a hand that stopped her. As you wish. Lionel nodded. Soon the group had entered the military tent. Lionel sat on one side of the table with Aina to his left and Mordred to his right. As for King Arthur, he sat to the right of his daughter. On the other side of the table, Noah faced Lionel with Jessica to his side. On the other side of Noah, there was another young man. The young man had his long hair done up in an elaborate bun that seemed to come straight out of an ancient world. He had sharp features and an even sharper gaze, all hidden behind his glasses. However, while the glasses Lionel's father wore were more of gimmick because he simply liked their appearance, Lionel could tell that the glasses of this young man were actually a treasure that helped boost his ocular ability. The young man swept a gaze toward Lionel before observing Mordred and then finally turning toward Aina. But before he could, Lionel snorted lightly. An audible crack resounded in the quiet room. The glasses of the young man snapped, their lenses breaking into tiny fragments. If it wasn't because the young man was quick to close his eyes as soon as he realized that something was wrong, he may very well have been blinded in that moment. Lionel's gaze didn't shift away from the young man as the latter slowly took his glasses off, his visage indifferent but the aura he was exuding reaching a tangible level. Watch where you're looking, please, or else I'll have to ask you to leave. Chapter 511. Lionel's voice came out with an undeniable edge to it. Those glasses, with his skill as a force crafter, he could easily see through their abilities. Even if this young man wasn't necessarily using it in a perverted manner, Lionel had no intention on relying on his good nature. The young man slowly placed his glasses down on the table before them, wiping away the small shards of glass that hadn't managed to pierce his skin. Judging by his expression, one would have never guessed that he had just been humiliated. His treasure could indeed see through more than what the human eye was capable of. As for whether he was truly planning on using his glasses like this, maybe only he was aware of the answer to that. The young man looked up from his broken glasses to Lionel, his gaze remaining even. Lionel matched his gaze, not a hint of remorse in his eyes. "My name is Noah Fox. I'm here on behalf of the Empire as the representative of the Fox royal family. This is Jessica Scarlet, she is the representative of the Scarlet Grand Prime Minister family. This is Tyrion Dove, he is the representative of the Dove Grand Prime Minister family." Noah didn't address the small scuffle between Lionel and Tyrion in the slightest. He made his way forward with introductions without a care. Lionel turned his gaze from Tyrion, focusing it on his cousin. He had to admit that Noah had perfected the air of a prince. In this regard he was far beyond Leonis despite being a few years younger. "The proposal is simple." Noah spoke with a royal air, his presence seeming several times larger than his actual stature would dictate. "Camelot and the Demon Empire will be annexed to become the second moon of Earth. Your status will be that of probationary citizens." Jessica. Jessica nodded, hearing her name called. "Probationary citizenship allows you 2/3 the rights of official citizens of Earth. You will be protected by the same laws, however your voting rights are reduced by 1/3 and your punishments are increased by the same measure. This status will last until the end of the war, wherein you will be instated as official citizens of the Empire. Depending on your performance, you may be conferred a Chief Earl title under the Pendragon name." Jessica brought out several drafted documents. They piled up onto the table, totaling at least a few dozen pages. King Arthur frowned at these words. He didn't like these terms very much at all. He was essentially tasked with defending what amounted to half a large continent of Earth in return for an Earl title? He might not know what the titles of Earth were and how they compared to Camelot's, but Earl was an easily identifiable title for him. That was enough to tell him that he would have next to no speaking power. However, instead of lashing out like he wanted to, he remained silent, leaving these matters in Lionel's hands. Since he had already resigned himself to this life, it hardly made a difference. Whether he was an earl or a duke, who cared if he was no longer king? Lionel didn't respond to Noah or Jessica. Instead he reached for the papers. Under the confused gazes of everyone present, he flipped through them one by one, not remaining on a single page for more than a second. Jessica's brow wrinkled slightly. Was he planning on reading it? But if he really was planning on reading it, why was he flipping through the pages so quickly? What Jessica didn't know was that Lionel had already slowed himself down considerably. Let alone a second a page, all he would have to do is spread these pages out and he could read all more than 50 sheets in that same time frame. After a while, Lionel placed the documents down and closed his eyes. Lionel quickly organized all the information, jumped through the legal talk and reached the core of the documents. Ultimately, this document was mostly created to familiarize Camelot with the laws of Earth. Only a small portion of it actually detailed the agreement between the two nations. But this was good for Lionel as well. Though he knew the main tenets of Earth's laws, when it came to the details he was severely lacking. The document was unlikely to list all of Earth's laws. After all, it was only a few dozen sheets, while Earth had long since moved past the usage of paper. Clearly they had only gone back due to the completion of the metamorphosis, making technology all but useless. But this was enough. Lionel opened his eyes. The simple action made Jessica shudder. But the feeling of oppression soon vanished as they regained their focus. Accept them as official citizens of the Empire, remove the guaranteed Chief Earl title, and document Camelot as a probationary province. Noah's expression finally shifted from something other than indifference. His head tilted slightly, a hint of questioning in his gaze. "If we do things like this, the Pendragon family will not be guaranteed any title. It is very possible that they will become commoners. Under these conditions, the people of Camelot are no longer of Camelot. As such, their merits are their own and won't count for the Pendragon family." Though the Empire's initial offer sounded bad, after reading the document, Lionel felt they were surprisingly fair. Probationary citizen sounded like a bad title, but it essentially allowed Camelot autonomy to continue functioning as its own nation until the war ended. As such, the merits of Camelot's armies would count toward Camelot and allow it to earn up to an Earl title in the end. But Lionel was essentially asking to remove this failsafe. By allowing Camelot to become official citizens of Earth right this moment, they were all starting as commoners. How could commoners lead people? Obviously they didn't have the right to do so. So, any merits Camelot accomplished would be equally spread to its millions of citizens rather than concentrating into Arthur's or Mordred's hands. Though this method would allow the Pendragons a chance to achieve a royal title higher than Earl, it also meant that they could effectively end up with nothing unless they had astounding single-person feats. Though the code black of the Empire seemed to throw the nobles to the wolves, the truth was that they still had many advantages commoners didn't have. As nobles, they had subordinates that were recognized by law. Those subordinates could funnel their merits toward these nobles, making it easier for them to retain their titles. However, if Arthur and Mordred became official citizens now, they wouldn't have this luxury any longer. I'm certain, Lionel replied. After all, as a prince, I can allocate my merits however I please. Noah's pupils constricted into pinholes. That was right. There was one family that didn't have to worry about democracy on Earth, and that was the Fox family. But how could Lionel alone amass more merits than those royal families with tens to hundreds of thousands of subordinates? Just as Noah wanted to open his mouth to say something, a talisman on Jessica's person suddenly glowed. At first, she listened to the message passed to her in silence, but after a while, her cold expression furrowed into a frown. Chapter 5:12. Jessica's expression only seemed to become worse with each passing moment. When the message finally came to a close, she began to whisper into Noah's ear. Clearly, the matter was too urgent for her to even consider leaving this place first. But it was precisely because of this that Lionel learned exactly what happened. With his senses, how could he not make out a whisper? In fact, even Aina was capable of doing the same thing. Though her mind wasn't on the same level as Lionel's, her five senses were greatly heightened. Dream Cloud Prison? Lionel's gaze narrowed. Dream Cloud Prison, compared to prisons from ancient times, could be considered a paradise. The Empire put a lot of effort into rehabilitation, more than what could be said for most nations of the past. However, even with this being the case, there were many who would never step foot outside of the prison. And many of those who never would, had never even committed crimes before. This sounded like a shocking matter, but considering the history of the Empire, maybe it wasn't so after a moment of thought. The gene analysis exam wasn't just a prerequisite for finding future talents. It was also a test for finding future criminals. Those that had a high potential to commit petty crimes in the future were mostly ignored. These individuals were allowed to live out their lives and would only be escorted to Dark Cloud Prison upon committing the crimes in question. However, there were those who were born with more sinister tastes, those who had a high potential for violence and murder. Those people were classified as grade prisoners and were introduced into Dark Cloud Prison in their infancy. They received visitation from their family. But, other than this, they would spend their lives within the walls of the Dark Cloud Prison. But this was only the beginning. While there were those with potential for horrid acts of violence and murder, there were others who not only had such desires, but also had tools to commit them that far surpassed the normal person. These people were geniuses who were born to be five-star professionals, prodigies that had impossible levels of intelligence to match their twisted nature. They were known as dark prisoners and received the highest level of security Dark Cloud Prison had to offer. As for whether it was ethical to punish people before they committed the crimes they were supposedly destined to, Lionel wasn't sure. If he was honest with himself, he never really thought about it before. Dark Cloud Prison was so far and away out of his mind in his day-to-day life that, like most privileged people, he just never thought about it. But now, it seemed that Dark Cloud Prison had no intention of staying away from his life any longer. That said, judging by Jessica's words, this seemed like a good opportunity. When Jessica finished whispering to Noah, his expression too became serious. Lionel smiled and looked toward Aina. Want to go to Dark Cloud Province? Jessica's lip twitched when she heard these words. He didn't even bother asking them first how they felt about it? And couldn't he have at least pretended as though he hadn't heard anything? After all, this was technically top-secret information. But when Jessica remembered that Lionel was also technically a prince, she realized that he really could do whatever he wanted. Unless her father or Tyrion's father was here, there would be no way to command him to do anything. And even in that case, Jessica somehow believed it wouldn't matter. After all, it really didn't seem like Lionel was relying on the prince title at all. He would have done whatever he wanted to do from the very beginning. Aina nodded at Lionel's suggestion. At this point, both of their goals were in sync. Aina wanted to grow stronger and so did Lionel. If he didn't grow stronger, how could he possibly upgrade the segmented cube to cure Aina? It settled then. Lionel smiled and looked back toward Noah, Jessica and Tyrion. I think my proposal was in line with the Empire's bottom line, correct? Noah gazed at Lionel for a moment before nodding. Good. Not long later, Noah, Jessica and Tyrion got up to leave. Tyrion left behind a slight smile, but didn't say anything from the start of the meeting to the end. It was difficult to tell if this was just his personality or if there was something else. So what hole did you throw me into, kid? Finally, Arthur couldn't hold back any longer. He had heard the negotiations, but without understanding Earth's laws, it was tough for him to follow everything that was said. In the end, he could only trust in Lionel, something that left him feeling somewhat uncomfortable. Lionel chuckled. It's a good thing, I promise. After Lionel finished his explanation, Mordred and Arthur fell into their own thoughts. So we have to rely on you? Arthur sighed. Well, not necessarily. Lionel said with a grin. What do you mean by that? Well, what do you think I was doing before I came to this battlefield? Wait, but according to your reasoning, anything we did before becoming official citizens is void. And even if our fight against White City was counted, it would be split even across every soldier that participated in the war. That wouldn't be enough merits to even trade for a Tier 4 official title, let alone a noble title. Arthur pressed his brows together. Yes, you weren't official citizens. But what about me? Lionel's grin widened. Arthur and Mordred suddenly came to a realization. That was right. While their merits would be mitigated, Lionel wasn't in the same boat. Hadn't he just wiped out 10 White Knights and over half of White City's elite forces practically on his own? Not only did a prince take out half of the army, but this prince's girlfriend also killed their city lord. Aina blushed slightly beneath her mask and looked away. But she didn't make any attempts to refute. Seeing such a scene, Mordred grinned and winked at Lionel only for him to put 2 big thumbs up. Aina can be considered a person under my wing, so you can say, effectively, all the merits for clearing out White City falls to us. Giving those merits over to the Pendragon family is well within my rights. Though I'm not sure how many merits the other nobles have, I read over the method of calculation. If my simulations are correct, there should already be no problem to trade for a Secretary Marquis title. Lionel smiled lightly, his cheeriness being seen in a new light by the father-daughter pair. Chapter 5:13. Do you want us to come with you? Mordred asked. Lionel shook his head. He was less interested about the state of Earth and more interested about his own personal strength growing. After witnessing Noah's comprehension of winter, he felt like he had finally come to understand something, so he wanted to test those waters. And even if he hadn't, it was better for Mordred and Arthur to stay here. I don't believe that they'll give up on Camelot so easily. Depending on how the wars on other provinces go, they might send another group here. It's best if you remain in this place. Arthur and Mordred nodded. But defending isn't all you should do. Lionel suddenly thought of something. Put some effort into organizing your people. With all of them slowly awakening to their abilities, there's definitely a lot of untapped potential. It's hard to tell how long this war will go on for, but Camelot could play a bigger role than it seems. I didn't say this before, but even if I can give you merits as a prince, there's still a limit to how much. For example, I can't just give you enough for a Grand Prime Minister title. If you wanted such a position, you'll have to fight for it yourself. Arthur's gaze narrowed, but in the end he nodded. After saying this, Lionel grabbed onto Aina's small hand and walked out of the military tent. He quite enjoyed the feeling, so he most definitely wouldn't let an opportunity to do so slip by. But while he was in his own world, he almost didn't notice that Noah and Jessica were actually still waiting for him outside, stationed before their troop. Noah looked between Lionel and Aina. Truthfully, he didn't know how a prince of the empire ended up with a woman of the hidden families. Even when he brought this up to his grandfather, Emperor Fox brushed it off without a care in the world as though it wasn't a big deal. In fact, his imperial grandfather even said that he should try to be more proactive in love too. Though his grandfather always seemed to have a warm air about him, Noah could feel the underlying oppression in his every action. Making such a joke in the past would have been impossible for the emperor. Yet he had this time. Imperial grandfather has said that we can lead this expedition together. Noah said calmly. You can receive the same Tier 7 general title I hold, and you can choose half of my men to be under your command. Normally, when such a thing happened, the person suffering the most would be infuriated. Noah was effectively losing half his fighting strength, and warriors he had carefully nurtured for the past more than year would be poached right beneath his eyes. But Noah didn't seem to care in the slightest. There weren't any fluctuations in his emotions, and he relayed his grandfather's orders without the smallest sign of reluctance. The various youths to Noah's back remained silent at these words. It was hard to tell if there was no uproar because it didn't matter to them one way or if they were simply just this well-trained. The number Noah led now was about half of what it once was, leaving it numbering at about 500. The remainder had been stationed at White City and it seemed the Tyrann had gone to manage the situation over there. Lionel raised an eyebrow and looked toward the youths. They had all been there when he lost his temper, flying into a rage. So, there was no need to question his strength. But, commanding a group of men and women went beyond just strength. It required judgment and intellect. Lionel wondered, should he take his grandfather up on his offer? Or should he go with Aina alone? After a while, Lionel made a decision. No, rather, it felt more like an instinct, as though he couldn't pick another way even if he tried. All right, Lionel said with a nod. Then he drew a line down the middle of Noah's troop and took half. Dark Cloud Province was an oddly peaceful place. Along with the capital, it was among the only two provinces of Earth that seemed completely unaffected by the metamorphosis. It was a place lush with nature. Green forests, tall mountains, and gently rushing rivers. It was almost a utopia. However, everyone knew that all of this terrain was purposely left here to make it even more difficult for prisoners to escape, not that they'd ever step foot out of the perimeter of Dark Cloud Prison, that is. The idea of an entire province being cornered off for a prison sounded insane. But, to summarize it not so many words, it was. Dark Cloud Prison was a massive hexagonal structure with a hollowed-out center. The rooms ringed the outside and thought they seemed to be open concept with plenty of windows. Everyone knew that even a missile wouldn't be capable of penetrating that glass. However, this was just the part of Dark Cloud Prison others could see. What many didn't know was that the hexagonal ring structure of Dark Cloud Prison dug deep underground for almost a kilometer, housing many more criminals than what met the eye. On one of these deepest floors, there was no sunlight to be seen, no open concept to marvel at, no nature to be in awe of. It was in this darkness that two guards walked, their steps uniform. Whose turn is it? One of them spoke. It should be time for prisoner #D1109. This guard was quite aware of how dangerous prisoners with the D prefix were. The only prisoners worthy of such a thing were dark prisoners. Yes. Since this is your first time, be cautious. Don't give him even a quarter of breathing space. Remember your training, this is not a joke. Do not be naive. The rookie guard nodded seriously. If he was one to take such matters lightly, he would have never been allowed this level of access. The two reached a dark cell door without so much as a small opening on it. After several procedures, they finally clicked open the heavy door as though it was a bank safe rather than a prison cell. The moment they did, an eerie chuckle reached their ears. #D1109? How inhumane. Why don't you call me by the name my mother gave me? Say it with me now. Leonella Morales. Quite easy to say, don't you think? At that moment, Dark Cloud Prison suddenly quaked. It felt as though the world was collapsing. Chapter 514. Lionel took a look at the more than 200 men and women before him. The eldest was no more than 25 while the youngest might have been 16 or 17. But all of them carried the experience of several battles. It was very clear that this wouldn't be their first stint. Though Lionel had the ability to do so, he didn't pick them based on their strength. He decided to choose randomly not only to leave some face for Noah, but because he didn't particularly care how strong they were. Honestly, he didn't know why he agreed to Noah's proposal. It was more of an impulse than anything else. But now that he had made his decision, there was no use in lamenting it. There was even something about it that filled him with a hint of excitement. His back stood just a bit straighter, his chest becoming just that small bit wider. The aura that surrounded his body caused them to fall in line, their expressions serious. Who are the leaders amongst you? Lionel finally spoke. The youths looked toward one another before a few stepped out. Among them, Lionel actually recognized one. Niall stood with a face even paler than Noah's had been. His arm was bandaged and wrapped. But, truthfully, there was no amount of bandages that could make up for a hole being blasted through your collarbone. It seemed as though someone had gone out of their way to secure his arm. As for whatever else was done, Lionel wasn't sure. After all, he wasn't trained in such things. All in all, there were 10 individuals including Niall who stepped out. Many of them had tired expressions. It was clear that it hadn't been too long since they conquered White City, but now, just when they thought they could finally go home, they were thrust into another matter. According to reports, Dark Cloud Prison had been attacked and at least 20% of the prison had been compromised, resulting in the sudden release of 23 329 C-grade prisoners, 12 802 B-grade prisoners, 2023 grade prisoners and 103 dark prisoners. Though the complex terrain around Dark Cloud Prison was marketed as a method of making it tougher for prisoners to escape, if this was really the goal, then the area around the prison would be nothing but flat land. It would be next to impossible to escape if there was no cover to hide behind. The truth of it was that with the wristwatch the Empire gave every newborn, there was no need to worry too much about escape. The terrain actually functioned twofold. The first was maintaining at least somewhat of an eco-friendly environment on Earth that didn't involve the oceans. For the second reason, it was so that the public would forget such a place existed to begin with. Not only were there no paradise islands that traveled over Dark Cloud Province, but it was practically untouched by human hands with the exception of the massive prison at its very center. But now, this terrain had become a massive obstacle for them to overcome. None of this even mentioned the fact that whoever had attacked the prison had done so with the express purpose of releasing these prisoners. If this was the case, then that definitely meant that there was a high likelihood that these prisoners were being funneled into whatever army's terrain was building. Though the C and B grade prisoners weren't guaranteed to have high combat prowess, it was a different story for A and dark prisoners. The Empire had already found a strong correlation between how well one performed on their gene analysis exams and the strength of the abilities they could awaken. Dark prisoners had a better than 50% chance to be variants or stronger by this point. This was most definitely not something to be taken lightly. While weak worlds like Terrain mostly relied on their force cultivation to display strength, talented worlds like Earth could get away with having weaker foundations in such areas as long as their abilities were up to a certain standard. If it wasn't for the fact Noah had purposely chosen to hold back and Arthur had yet to learn how to control his ability, there was no way that City Lord White would have had such an easy time. However, with all of this said, the actions of Terrain were most definitely a double-edged sword. Taking advantage of the strength of these men and women would be one matter, but whether they would truly be able to control them was a different matter entirely. Lionel scanned the 10 before him. Other than Nile, there were 6 other young men and 3 young women. The weapons among them also varied greatly. While some chose to wield cold weapons, some had more modern weapons as well. These modern weapons were enhanced, but also didn't rely on advanced technology. After some inspection, Lionel realized that these modern weapons were actually treasures. Though they appeared to be of Earth's technology, they were much more like Lionel's first creations, the long-nozzle pistols. Interesting. Lionel wondered if this was because other worlds had been observing Earth's technology to make these or if maybe Earth's technology wasn't as unique as he once believed. Of course, there was another possibility, and that was that Earth had force crafters of its own that he was unaware of. If this last point was true, then it seemed that that mysterious grandfather of his had more hidden cards than it seemed. But, at the same time, a hidden card wouldn't be so hidden if it was out for all to see like this. So Lionel dismissed the idea. It was more than likely a combination of the first 2 possibilities. 23 speed types. 19 defensive types. 21 attack types. 7 healing types. 48 body enhancement types. 39 force strengthening deviation types. 13 sensory types. 10 all-rounders. 74 unique, unclassifiable abilities. Lionel summarized quickly. Chapter 5:15. The 10 all-rounders were, of course, the 10 who stood before him. Their abilities separated from the unclassifiable abilities in that they had several strong points rather than one odd strong point. For example, among the 74, there was a young woman with an ability similar to King Arthur's. Except, rather than become streams of light, she became an odd liquid thicker than water. She could also coat her skin and her surroundings with this liquid to form a pseudo-domain of sorts that worked well for her. But, in a team battle, her uses were minimal. The defensive nature of her ability was only useful for her and couldn't truly be extended to others. At the same time, she wasn't a very good attacker either. In fact, she was weak in this regard. That said, if her ability was applied well, she would be among the strongest single combatants. Just trying to deal with her domain without slipping about wildly would be a headache even for Lionel. If he was in such a situation, he would be forced to use his surfboard and bombard her with arrows from above. He would stand little chance in normal hand-to-hand combat. However, the 10 youths that stood before Lionel were much different in this regard. Take Nile for example. Nile seemed to have a short-range teleportation ability. If not for this, how could he have possibly intercepted Lionel on his way to Noah back then? But, his ability was actually more complex than this. It could be used not only to enhance his speed but also in defense and attacking. He was able to displace not only himself in space, but also his spear and attacks aimed toward him. Of course, his manipulation of the extremely rare Space Force strengthening deviation was limited. But it was still among the reasons he was one of the most powerful combatants here. If it wasn't because he had faced Lionel, he wouldn't have lost so swiftly. With his ability alone, Niall could easily take responsibility for the safety of a 10-man party without hindering the abilities of those who were a part of his squad. This was the fundamental difference between him and the young girl. Since things are like this, I'll organize you as follows. The speed types will form 8 squads of 2 to 3. Your roles will be to maintain a perimeter around our troops in 8 directions and disrupting any forward momentum of any enemies you might run across. As for communication and the method of disruption, leave that to me. The remaining 200 or so of you, not including sensory types, healing types, or all-rounders, will form into squads of 10. The makeup of these squads will be 3 shield warriors, formed of either a defensive type or a body enhancement type, 3 assault units, formed of attack types and force strengthening deviation types, and finally 4 unique ability types. You 10 all-rounders, you will take the lead of 2 of these 10-man squads each. The remaining 20 of you, 7 healers and 13 sensory types, will be responsible for both relaying my orders and maintaining the peak condition of the troop. Communication will be key. Lionel spoke all of these matters out in a single breath, not wasting any time. However, the youths before him couldn't help but wonder if Noah had given him information about them before. But, when they thought about how Lionel had randomly chosen them and how he hadn't seemed to be aware of the fact he would be gaining such troops to command beforehand, they couldn't help but be astonished. Could this be his ability? Or was it a treasure of some kind? What they didn't know was that it could technically be both for Lionel. He could use the dictionary to learn of their abilities. But after the upgrade to his own, he found that making accurate guesses of the abilities of others had become much easier. Though he couldn't claim to comprehend as much detail as the dictionary had, it was definitely far less hazy than the past. Of course, he also saw that the more powerful the ability wielded by a person, the harder it was for him to see through it. But this much was already far better than what most could accomplish. Lionel was definitely in a league of his own in this regard. Soon, Lionel had finished organizing the army and he walked up to Niall. How much of your strength can you display right now? Pale-faced, Niall still stood at attention. There wasn't a hint of hatred for Lionel in his eye. In fact, it now held the same respect it had for Noah. However, it was hard to tell if this was because Lionel had defeated him so easily, or if it was because he now knew that Lionel was a prince. It could only be said that if it was the latter, the brainwashing of the Empire was truly something to behold. I can display about 20% of my strength, Your Highness. Niall replied seriously. Lionel's eyes sparkled. He hadn't asked this question because he wanted to know, but rather because he wanted to probe Niall's attitude. Seeing it, even he couldn't help but feel somewhat guilty. Golden lights surged around Lionel and descended upon Niall. The accumulation of light elemental force was so strong that it practically became blinding. Very quickly, Niall's face became more ruddy, his shallow breathing becoming deep and full once again. Under the shocked gazes of those spectating, Niall's state continuously became better. When Lionel lowered his hand, though Niall wasn't back to peak condition, he was clearly much better. It wouldn't be an issue for him to display 80% of his strength. Niall's eyes widened. Thank you, Your Highness. Lionel smiled and waved a hand. I want to apologize for what I did because that would be hypocritical. Truthfully, if you stood in my way again, I would treat you the same way. Niall paled somewhat hearing these words, but he inwardly felt more respect for Lionel after hearing them. He didn't want to be treated like a dog who could be coddled with a carrot and a stick. He wasn't a person that a bad guy good guy routine could work on. Such a thing would only be effective for those who were weak of mind. But those are matters of the past. We all have the same goal right now, and that's to repel these invaders. Niall nodded seriously, his back standing somewhat straighter. From now on, don't call me Your Highness or Prince, call me Captain. What I value most are 2 things, respect and persistence. Respect for your fellow man and woman. Give everything you have to them and prepare to receive everything they have in return. Persist for your fellow warriors. Give everything you have and expect nothing. Lionel scanned the organized group of youths before him, his aura towering. He looked more like a sturdy pillar, prepared to hold up even the skies rather than a simple young man. The blood of the youths involuntarily boiled. From indifference, their faces somewhat reddened, their hearts beating a step faster. Respect with your all and expect everything. Persist with your all and expect nothing. Respect was a mindset. Persistence was an action. The meaning of it all was simple. If you gave your heart and bled on the battlefield, it was only right that you expect the same. If you gave your soul and died on the battlefield, it was only right you expect nothing. These words were suddenly engraved onto their souls. Chapter 5:16. Dark Cloud Prison descended into mania. One of the 6 sections completely collapsed, leaving a scene one thought should have been a catastrophe. But, while some did indeed die, the resulting explosion was rather controlled. It was obvious to any third-party observer that this was all planned, down to the final dotted I and crossed T. Ho ho ho. Lionel chuckled. Author's note: from now on, whenever referring to Lionel, I will write it as Lionel. They are pronounced the same, so it should help with the flow of the story. But do keep in mind that this Lionel has a name spelled and said the exact same way as our favorite MC. Lionel sat on the damp cell floor, his arms wrapped around his body. Of course, this wasn't by choice. The straitjacket they forced him to stay in was made of materials far tougher than Kevlar. As though that wasn't enough, it was reinforced with several locks and chains. Even if he wanted to unwind his arms, he didn't have the luxury. One would think that they would at least let him out to take a shower, but he didn't have this luxury either. Rather, every time the stink got to be too much, they'd bathe him in UV-type light and send him on his way. The result of this treatment for almost 2 decades now was a man who smelt somewhat like 1 part vegetable left to dry beneath the sun for too long and another part cured meat. In the darkness it was hard to see his face at all. Or rather, he had a habit of speaking with his head lowered, his messy hair covering much of his face. However, if the guards had a choice, they'd prefer him to keep his head lowered just like this. So close. Lionel continued to chuckle. If that blast was 2% stronger, I would be free. What a shame, what a shame. The rookie guard felt a cold chill at the back of his neck, the ground still trembling beneath their feet. What? The rookie guard began to speak, but his next words were caught in his throat when he saw the unsightly expression on his partner's face. What is it? The rookie suddenly entered high alert, his hand hovering over his weapon. The veteran guard took deep breaths, trying to calm himself, his gaze never leaving Lionel. If others saw his actions, they would think that he was insane. Why he was so focused on a man who couldn't move an inch. Maybe only those of Dream Cloud Prison would know. Listen, rookie. Back away slowly. Stay on high alert. If needed, don't hold back. The rookie guard's pupils constricted. You mean? Yes. Do whatever is necessary. A cold shiver traveled up the rookie's spine, his muscles tensing. The first thing any new guards of Dark Cloud Prison were taught was the importance of information. This wasn't a lesson about learning as much as you could. No, it was a lesson in keeping as much of it away from these prisoners as possible. Dark prisoners were incarcerated from the time they were toddlers to the day of their deaths. Most couldn't even remember a world outside of these walls. In fact, their only interactions with the world should have been at these moments where food was brought to them. Any understanding of language these prisoners had should have been from their short time as members of society. In fact, that went for all their understandings. With all this said, there was one matter in particular that they wanted to keep from these prisoners: the metamorphosis. Those prisoners that became invalids were silently killed. There weren't any Paradise Islands above Dark Cloud Province. Even guards were diligently trained in combat without their abilities. From day one of training, they were drilled in the fact that use of one's abilities should be a final resort. Yet now, the veteran guard was saying to use any means necessary. The rookie's breathing couldn't help but grow shallow, a cold sweat slowly trickling down his forehead. Tisk tsk. Is there a need for such caution? Didn't I already say it was a shame? The veteran's jaw steeled. How did you learn about percentages? #D1109? Lionel paused for a moment before his laughter returned, stronger than before. His hair dangled across his face, vibrating to his cadence. The veteran guard's countenance became more chilly, still taking slow steps back. Oops, my tongue must have slipped. What else can you expect from me? My street smarts are still a bit lacking. I've seen too little of the world. Where did you hear the name Lionel Morales from? The guard continued coldly, trying to buy time for the rookie to inch away and report this matter to the warden. Lionel froze. But this time his laughter didn't come. An eerie silence hung over the cell as the ground continued to rumble. Where did I hear it? From the lips of my own mother before you ripped me away from her and threw me into this place. The voice didn't carry any sort of emotion, to the point it sounded somewhat mechanical, as though it was an automated message rather than the words of a human. The veteran and rookie froze. Fear the likes of which they had never experienced in their lifetimes took hold of their hearts, clenching it tightly. Blood flew, splashing against the walls. The crimson sparkled in the darkness, looking like the wings of a fallen angel. Warden. Warden. The rumbling of the prison's framework couldn't stop the booming of this voice. A mixture of panic, shock and horror laced it, coloring the roar with emotion. Within an office on the lowest floor of Dark Cloud Prison, one could find the warden. He was a man of average height but broad presence. His graying mustache hung over his lip with the thickness of a forest bush. His every breath was deep and unfathomable. If one paid attention, it would be easy to notice that every cycle of inhaling and exhaling took a full minute to complete. Yet, this warden completed it with absolute ease. At that moment, the warden was shirtless. Despite his old age, his body rippled with strength, his torso having a level of tone that left men half his age in shame. A healthy bronze sheen glistened across his skin, making him look more like a fitness model rather than the warden of a prison. This man was none other than Governor Duke Escobar Owen. Before the shouting guard could even reach the office, Escobar put on his black military uniform, hiding his toned body, and opened the door, his demeanor steely and indifferent. Warden. #D1109 has escaped. If Lionel had been there, he would have immediately recognized this warden. He was none other than Coach Owen, a man Lionel respected almost as much as his own father. Chapter 517. Coach Owen's expression solidified. Of all of them, why did it have to be him? The words the warden spoke were hardly audible. In fact, in his panic, the guard across from him didn't seem to pick up on the oddity either. Seeing the sorry performance of the person that was supposed to be his right-hand man, Escobar snorted, his thick mustache rustling. Get yourself together. The low shout snapped the lead guard into attention, his heels slamming together as his back arched as though a string had been pulled from the top of his head. Gather the men. Escobar said coldly. We're going hunting. Yes, sir. The lead guard spun and jetted off, his speed beyond normal human limits. Escobar watched this with narrowed eyes, inwardly lamenting the state the metamorphosis had put his best man in. Though the ability awakened by his lead guard, Garwin, was especially powerful, it left his personality somewhat warped. Garwin was able to control the balance of hormones and neurotransmitters in his body. The good news was that much like Aina, he could very easily train his body to surpass its limits even without outside influences. In fact, he was better than even Aina in some ways because while Aina was limited in simply making her body stronger, Garwin could strengthen his mind and thinking speed as well. However, there were major downsides to Garwin's ability as well. Oftentimes, the more powerful an ability, the more complex it was and the more difficult it was to control. On top of this, in order to maximize his ability, Garwin had to come up with many unique use cases for it, much like Lionel had to or like Simeon with his gene manipulation ability. The more difficult an ability was to control, the more potential pitfalls there were. Though Lionel had yet to run into any on his own, Garwin hadn't been so lucky. Because of how sensitive his abilities were, his hormones could easily be set out of whack, causing him to react inappropriately to many situations. In the past, he had been a man no less stoic than Governor Duke Owen. But after the metamorphosis, his emotions were more varied and unpredictable. However, he was simply too important to Dark Cloud Prison. His fighting capabilities were even beyond Governor Duke Owen's now. This was something the warden had no choice but to admit. If they wanted to place these criminals back where they belonged, Garwin would have to be a key cog. The warden walked back into his office, finding a particular cabinet of files and opening it. His expression became more somber the more he flipped, but his pace didn't accelerate, only remaining even from start to finish. Finally, he landed on a particular file by the title of #D1109. The first picture he saw in the file was of a baby with large pale green eyes. The small boy had a small button nose and messy dirty blonde hair. All in all, he was an adorable child. But there was something off about the photo. The longer one stared at it, the more uncomfortable you would feel. The longer one looked, the less this baby boy appeared to be a baby boy at all. The warden had lost count of how many times he had stared at this photo, but it wasn't until recently that he realized what was so off about it all. It was the eyes. This baby's eyes didn't have the innocent light of a child nor the curious nature of a newborn. Rather, its gaze was vacant, continuously staring back at you as though it already had everything figured out. Coach Owen sighed. The rest of the document was filled with redactions. Place of birth, parenthood, even the date of birth was crossed. There was nothing but this picture in the prisoner's code. Nothing more, nothing else. So similar, the warden couldn't help but feel that his life's work was nothing but garbage. Only he and a few select people knew the truth of these matters, but what he did know left him feeling cold. Your resentment, I understand it. However, I cannot allow you to do as you please. It seems that I will need to kill you with my own hands. The warden put the file away, locking the cabinet as Dark Cloud Prison continued to tremble. Then he turned and walked out of his office, his mustache bristling. Scouting units, move out. Lionel commanded. The speed types jetted out in 8 different directions, each of them leaving blazing trails of wind in their wake. To the back of the troop, there was a large lingering mountain range. Since Earth had long since mastered terraforming technology, allowing the continents to come together to form a single supercontinent, it also took advantage of this technology to make Dark Cloud Province as inaccessible as possible. As a result, there were only 2 paths to enter this province that didn't include the sky: the Northern Passage and the Southern Passage. Noah and Lionel had split into 2 groups, each manning one of the passages. Lionel was tasked with bringing support from the south. According to what Lionel understood, Dark Cloud Province already had its own forces, obviously. They were simply bringing support. In addition, it would be their job to capture any escapees once the situation was settled. Aside from this, they would have to worry about the forces of terrain that had been sent to this location, which should include the forces of Hargrove City. Lionel took the vanguard of the army with Aina by his side. She held onto her great sword, a serious light hidden behind the slits of her mask. The forest was quite dense. Moving in such a large group would make things difficult, so Lionel took advantage of the 10-man squads he had formed and had them fan out. It would be difficult to fight any large-scale battles in this place, but that also went for the enemy as well. With the makeup of the squads, it would be much easier for them to deal with issues. At that moment, Lionel's gaze suddenly sharpened. As expected. Just a few seconds after Lionel had the thought, a communication talisman lit up by his side and entered his ears silently. Captain, Squad Northwest has detected the movement of enemy scouts. They number 7. Standing by for orders. It was impossible for Terrain to not also be aware that there were only 2 entry paths to Dark Cloud Province. In that case, how could they not erect their own blockades to stop incoming reinforcements? Chapter 5:18. Lionel sent a gaze toward Aina only to find her already looking back toward him. With a light nod, they shot forward as one, their steps light and in sync. The remainder of the troops continued to advance slowly. Though they exchanged some glances about the oddity of it all, they didn't make any other movements. Something like a commander taking the vanguard was practically unheard of, at least in Earth's modern history. However, Lionel had made his plan to them clear. A count of 250 wasn't a lot, especially in a war of this scale. Where their benefit lay is in the fact they were all elite warriors, all capable of battling 2 to 3 on their own. In such a case, not only was such a forest the best terrain for them, but it also presented a unique opportunity to flip this war on its head. Lionel's lips moved, but no one seemed to hear what he said at all. However, several hundred meters away, the Northwest squad had already jumped into action. Despite the high sun, the forest was still drenched in shadows. From below the high canopies, it felt more like a cloudy day than anything else. Unfortunately, unlike a cloudy day, the forest floor was quite humid. Any normal human of the 3rd dimension would be leaking sweat by this point. Luckily, though, Earth was still in its infant stages as a new 4th-dimensional world. As such, the harsher climates of a world at this stage had yet to come to fruition. However, even still, the hot temperatures were slowly creeping upward and breaking records that had withstood the test of centuries, while the cold temperatures were doing the same. It wouldn't be long before Earth began to face extremes it never had before. While there was this bad news, though, there was also good news. In this transition period, zones wouldn't begin to appear just yet. So Earth had a small level of reprieve. But it might have been exactly because of this that Terrain chose to attack now. At that moment, on the humid forest floor, a group of 7 moved forward cautiously along their patrol path, their senses on high alert. They wore red robes accented by bright yellow flexible armor. The design made them look like small boiling suns of their own, but judging by the small beads of sweat falling down their brow, this had little to do with their affinities. The lead of the 7 men suddenly snapped his head in a certain direction, just in time to see a small orb of light land in their midst. A hint of panic colored his features. But just when he was frozen in horror, the small globe of light pulsed, sending out a halo that covered a 10-meter radius. Without hesitation, the lead scout pulled out a talisman and ripped it. The talisman was torn in two, causing a flare of flames to light it quickly. The sparks coalesced, concentrating into a bead and shooting up into the skies. But just as it was about to break past, it rammed into the halo of light. One would have expected a bang, but the reality was much less fantastical. The spark fizzled out, drooping back down to the ground as though it had run out of oxygen to fuel itself. The lead scout's eyes widened. He opened his mouth and roared at the top of his lungs. His shout was so loud that the six that followed him covered their ears, clenching their jaws. The lead scout relaxed when he completed this action, his unsettled emotions resting into a sneer. He slowly pulled out twin daggers that rested on his hips. He felt that everything was over now. Now that they knew that Earth had indeed sent reinforcements, it would be a matter of absolute ease for them to be surrounded and killed one by one. Earth didn't have technology anymore, so sending in reinforcements through the air was almost impossible. There was no way they had aerial units prepared already. And even if they did, there was no way they could match the units terrain had scouting up above. So they would have no choice but to send ground troops. But in such a thick forest, how many could they really send? If they were smart, they would send a small unit of elites with a few trump cards. That orb of light was clearly one of Earth's trump cards, but it also displayed Earth's naivete. There was more to contend with than just tools. If Earth couldn't come up with methods of countering a variety of abilities as well, they would be finished. This was the perfect example. They were prepared to stop their signal flare, but they had no method of stopping his shout. The lead scout's sneer deepened. What a fledgling world. It's clear you don't deserve these lands, so well be happy to take it off your hands. It was at that exact moment that Lionel and Aina appeared. They weaved through the trees, one wielding a great sword and the other flipping his palm to take out a pitch-black bow. Aina continued to shoot forward while Lionel leapt up agilely. His feet rebounded off the tough bark of the trees, sending him flying upward. He left a trail of gold in his wake. And for but a moment, his arms seemed to have unfurled into the wings of a bird. Behind her beautiful icy blue-white mask, Aina crossed the final barrier into the halo of light, her sword trailing behind her like the tail of a comet. A little girl? Is this a joke? The lead scout almost couldn't rein in his laughter. Fine, I'll pry that little mask off you and see what kind of beauty it's hiding. Lionel lightly stepped onto a branch over 15 meters above the ground. With swift motions, he knocked 6 arrows at once, a cold, calculating glint in his eye. By the time Aina prepared to swing her sword toward the lead scout, he had already pulled his bowstring back. Even after reaching the 4th dimension in his physique, Lionel could only pull his bowstring back just over 50% of the way, displaying the furious strength of this bow quite clearly. But 50% was still almost overkill. Sure. Lionel released 6 arrows at once just as Aina swung her sword toward the lead scout. At that moment, the lead scout's expression finally changed. The difference was too stark, how could he miss it? In one instant, he couldn't hear the whistling of Aina's sword or the shocking charge of Lionel's arrows. But in the next moment, it barraged his senses as though they wouldn't allow him to focus on anything else. No. Unfortunately, it was too late for the lead scout to understand that his first instinct should have been to run. Chapter 519. Lionel's arrow pierced 6 skulls as Aina's sword split the lead scout in two. Lionel leapt down to the ground, the soil shifting beneath his heavy fall. It worked well, Aina said. But it still has some flaws. Lionel nodded in agreement. A smarter scout would have realized they couldn't hear anything much quicker. We got lucky this time because this one is used to having his hearing compromised, but it won't necessarily happen again. With the way he and Aina were charging through the forest, no matter how light their steps were, it was impossible for them to not have made a single sound. A smarter scout would have realized very quickly that the barrier Lionel erected could both block their signal flares and any sound they made. Once they realized this, their first instinct would have been to run rather than holding their ground. After all they had to do was leave the 10-meter radius of the halo to send out a signal. Even if they couldn't survive, it was their role as scouts to send such valuable information back. But luckily, ironically due to his shouting ability, the lead scout's hearing was compromised along with the 6 that followed him. So, he didn't notice the oddity until it was too late. Is it possible to make the sound filter one way? Aina asked. It's possible, but it would double the production time. With the time crunch we're on, I'm not sure if it's worth it. Lionel was the only one who could make these orbs of light. And, unfortunately, they were one-use objects with a very limited lifespan, which meant that he would have to make a new one for each one of these operations. The Northwest Squad came out of their hiding places, displaying speed that even surpassed Lionel and Aina. At least, it surpassed the speed they had displayed to this point. It seemed that this squad was quite capable indeed. Captain. Lionel nodded. Right, this region is still your responsibility. Lionel raised a hand and caused a surge of fire elemental force to burn the 7 corpses before him. The halo of light pulsed, causing the scent of burning flesh to be purified and dispersed. With that, Lionel and Aina shot back toward the main group. The members of Northwest Squad looked at one another with deep meaning in their eyes. It had been them who threw out the orb on Lionel's command to begin with, so they were an integral part of the operation. They had to say that they were surprised by the efficiency. If things continued like this, they would have a good chance of performing well. This was enough to tell them that though their styles were different, Lionel's leadership ability was no less than Noah's. But, where they separated was in the usefulness of Lionel's skills. While their leadership abilities didn't differ by much, Lionel's skill as a force crafter made his plans work out with much more smoothness and ease. Their lives hadn't even been on the line even once, yet 7 enemies had died. It was truly baffling. With a light nod to one another, the 3 members of Northwest Squad shot in different directions, their eyes flashing with more determination. At that moment outside of Dark Cloud Prison, an odd scene could be seen. On one side there was a hexagonal prison. But, on another, there was a city that seemed to have dropped out of the skies. Of the 6 sides of this hexagonal prison, one had completely collapsed. And this collapsed portion just happened to be the section facing the out-of-place city. For any third-party observer, it was easy to deduce what happened. This city fell from the skies and caused the damage they were now seeing. But, what was maybe more surprising was that even with such a disastrous event occurring, the prison only lost a 1/6 of its integrity. If Lionel could see this sight, he would be shocked beyond belief before marveling at Earth's ability. Camelot was almost upturned by the fall of just one city. Yet, despite the city having fallen not even half a kilometer from Dark Cloud Prison, it only suffered the collapse of a single side. However, at that moment, there was nothing the guards and warden of Dark Cloud Prison felt happy about. With the prison compromised, a large swath of prisoners found the light of day for the first time in decades. What they didn't know was that the restrictions of Dark Cloud Prison went beyond just walls and bars. The very materials of the prison was capable of blocking influxes of force. This caused even those who successfully managed to awaken their abilities to have little chance at sensing and using them. This technology went beyond force disruption towers. Even with the descent of the 4th dimension, it was completely unaffected because it relied on metals from the 4th dimension itself. As for whether or not terrain was aware of this fact, it was unknown. But, what was certain was that with the collapse of the prison, this system was compromised. While these special metals were effective in some cases, they also had far more limitations than force disruption towers. Simply being in their vicinity wasn't enough. One had to be enclosed by them or in contact with them. In addition, just like how force disruption towers were useless in the 4th dimension, these metals were useless against abilities in the 5th dimension and above. Due to this, the appearance of the city caused many prisoners who hadn't been aware of their abilities in the past to suddenly become enlightened, causing chaos to reign. The sound of battle filled the halls of the prison, leaking out through its cracked and falling walls. But this would soon be the least of their worries. City Lord Hargrove, a slender man with a drooping gray mustache that swept past his chest, stood atop the city wall, eyeing the prison as though he saw prey. Prisoners of Dark Cloud. His voice suddenly boomed, reverberating through the collapsed walls. Do you want your freedom? Do you want revenge? The Empire of Earth has done nothing but take from you. Do you want to make them pay? Do you want to see the capital washed in blood? Do you want to see the head of Emperor Fox on a pike? Join us. Chapter 520. Archers. City Lord Hargrove's voice boomed once more. In one moment, there was no one but this singular, seemingly frail city lord to be found on the city's walls. But, in the next moment, 2 rows of over 100 archers appeared, each with the light of an expert in their eyes. It became clear very quickly that Hargrove had no intention charging into the prison. Why would he undertake such a thankless task? No, his goal was simple. Any guards or wardens that escaped this prison would find an arrow between the eye. As for the prisoners, they would be welcomed with open arms. The prisoners of Earth provided two opportunities. Not only would they give a large influx of talented individuals, but they would also be able to gain the same number in fifth-generational persons. This killed two birds with just a single stone. The only large clearing one could find on Dark Cloud Province was in this very place. About a kilometer around the hexagonal prison was nothing but flat concrete. With the appearance of Hargrove City, this concrete was now filled with spiderweb-like cracks, but it served its purpose to perfection. Without any place to hide, how could the guards of Dark Cloud Prison possibly protect themselves against the assault of 100 elite archers? At that moment, a head peeked out from behind the rubble. Dust and soot covered this person's face, making it difficult to tell if they were male or female at first glance. It seemed that whoever this person was, they had chosen to shave their head bald. When this prisoner saw the rows of archers in the distance, they panicked and ducked back down. However, they soon calmed. If Lionel had been there, he would be shocked to realize that he recognized this person. It was none other than the younger brother of the demoted vice commander of the Slayer Legion, Damien. There's a massive city that appeared out of nowhere. Damien reported to the prisoners that had followed behind him. They have 100 archers all primed and ready. Among them, there were a few who had attacked on that day, including his elder brother Joseph. One would think that as members of the most notorious group of rebels, they would have been thrown into a much deeper part of Dark Cloud Prison. But their allocations showed just how much disregard the Empire had for their efforts as a whole. Despite having once been a vice commander of the Slayer Legion, Joseph, even as the highest-rated prisoner among them, was still a mere C-grade prisoner, just like the rest of them. In truth, such treatment had hurt more than anything else. They would rather have been treated like the lowliest of scum, been underfed, beaten and abused. But what they actually got was a cushy cell, 3 meals a day and a psychiatrist to vent to. It felt as though they were children put on timeout rather than criminals who had risked their lives every day for the sake of forging a better future for themselves. This had been an insult worse than anything they had ever experienced before, and that sort of treatment made their hatred of the Empire burn even more fervently. And along with that, their hatred of Lionel increased proportionally. When Damien's whispers reached their ears, the prisoners panicked somewhat. The truth was that most of them weren't hardened criminals. Aside from those who were from the Slayer Legion, the rest had only committed petty crimes. Facing such a situation, many of them weren't sure how to react. Knowing this, there was no wonder those of the Slayer Legion felt so insulted. They were placed in the same cells as men and women whose worst crime might have been trespassing onto the wrong property or shoplifting. The only difference between them and the Slayer Legion members was that while they would get out, those of the Slayer Legion would be here for life. Until now. This definitely isn't a decoy. Joseph spoke, his expressions much less cheery as compared to the past. Even if the Empire wanted to con us, they wouldn't destroy the prison to do so, and they definitely wouldn't dare to speak ill of Emperor Fox toward that end. It's more than likely that those archers are there to act as our cover. But should we really trust them and go? We have no idea who these people are. They haven't announced their affiliations. Damien said slowly. The only reason Damien and Joseph had been so quick to attempt to escape despite understanding the iron fist that was the Empire was because they thought that maybe the Slayer Legion was finally taking large-scale action. The truth was that before Damien and Joseph chose to take a maddened attempt at conquering Royal Blue Fort, the Slayer Legion was prepping for something. As for what they were planning, the brothers couldn't be sure. But they felt as though they would be left behind if they didn't take a massive leap forward. Obviously, their attempt failed, but now they were hoping that this matter was related to the Slayer Legion. However, if it truly was, then why wouldn't they announce this? From start to finish, Hargrove didn't mention their origins, something that made the brothers feel antsy about trusting such an unknown entity. No matter what, they weren't fools. As the first prisoners to make it to this opening, they had obviously been on the highest floors. As such, the level of torture they had suffered in this prison could be considered to be null. They simply weren't as desperate as those A and dark prisoners. So, they were far more clear-minded at this moment. Joseph hesitated, finding his brother's words to be true. At this point, he no longer held the decisiveness he had in the past. The man bold enough to target a fort of the Empire as a mere vice-commander was no longer here. Damien's gaze flashed with a hint of rage looking at the shell of a man his brother had become, but he didn't say anything else. At this point, maybe the elder brother he once knew would never come back. At that moment, though, a resonating laughter shook the collapsed halls. Bang! A man shot up from a floor below, crashing through the walls and jetting out of the prison. Freedom! His roar was so loud that even the concrete beneath his feet splintered even more. The man's gaze locked onto the city in the distance. Take down the empire? The emperor's head on a pike? I'm not sure what this empire is or who this emperor is, but I'll take you up on your offer anyway. An uproarious laughter shook Dark Cloud Province. Chapter 521. The man looked massive, something that was inconceivable considering the level of security he would have had to live under for his entire life. He wore a gray uniform with a single zipper that went from his collar to his crotch. On his left chest, a bright red tag shone, #D2901. The air around this man seemed to grow solid, a palpable killing intent hanging heavily around him. It shouldn't have been possible for even a grade prisoner to become so large, let alone a dark prisoner. Their meals were perfectly measured to maintain health and prevent starvation, but it shouldn't have been enough to feed their strength, let alone growing to have such a muscular body. There was no doubt that whatever ability this man had, his strength was related to it. City Lord Hargrove's expression flickered. He doesn't know what the Empire is? Or who the Emperor is? Interesting, it seems that we've underestimated just how villainous this Ascension Empire is. Hargrove should have known. Any empire that dared to name itself Ascension had to be arrogant without regard. There was a reason those of the dimensional verse described the evolution of a world as the descent of a dimension. It was supposed to represent a bestowal by the universe. Whether it be the talent or potential of a world, it was all gifted. A world didn't grow to accept an evolution, rather an evolution fell upon a certain world. This was the subtle difference. This was the core truth behind dimensional descent. Yet, whether by coincidence or by a lofty purpose, Earth's empire named itself Ascension. Arrogance didn't even begin to describe such bloviating. It almost made Hargrove laugh in rage. As a man born in a world with such little talent, he understood this bestowal the most. Yet, this Earth, despite being lucky enough to be gifted such prospects, actually believed that they could snub their noses at it. Hargrove raised his head, a billowing laughter leaving his lips. His long mustache caught a wind, whipping about wildly along with the rest of his hair. His hands clasped behind his back, his chest standing wide and broad. We accept one and all. #D2901 laughed when he heard these words. His legs flexed, the ground beneath him cracking once again. Bang! He shot into the skies, crossing a 50-meter length in a single bound. Just as he was making his way through, another group of prisoners charged out. Damien, Joseph and the others could no longer wait. This wasn't because they decided to trust these people, but rather because the appearance of this man had sent the guards into a frenzy. The guards at their level of security was minimal. After the destruction of the prison, Damien could use his ability again. As a person who had an S-grade ability upon awakening, his ability had long since crossed into the 5th dimension now. So, defeating a few low-level guards had been especially easy. But they weren't fools. They knew that the guards on the lower levels were no laughing matter. If they couldn't leave now, they might never leave. As expected, the moment Damien, Joseph and the others bolted out of their hiding spots, running full speed for the city in the distance, the first guard appeared. Unable to wield their normal weapons any longer, they wielded cold weapons. However, their actions didn't seem awkward in the slightest. It seemed that they were most definitely well trained in the regard. One prisoner after another poured out. It was clear that #D2901 had carved out a path for them all. The maddening howls of laughter shook the prison, causing a cold shiver to take hold of C and B grade prisoners. They had all heard stories about how insane the prisoners below were. It was impossible for them to spend so many decades within these walls and not see certain oddities. However, after seeing these men and women for themselves, they all realized one thing. They were insane. Many of them, clearly unused to walking on their own 2 feet, ran on all fours. Some rolled about as though they were balls rather than humans. A few chose to walk on their hands, shooting off toward Hargrove City in a mad dash. The normal prisoners amongst them, wearing #CS and #BS across their chests, had never felt such fear in their lives. They gathered into groups, hoping that they wouldn't lose their lives in a maddened assault. A young acrobatic woman charged through the concrete on her palms. Her concept of the world were so shallow that she didn't seem to understand shame at all. Her prison garbs were completely unzipped and her small breasts hung out, jiggling about as she planted her palms one after another. Her head peeked upward as she curiously observed the fear in the eyes of the normal prisoners by Damien's side. She had never seen such emotion before. She wondered where it was coming from. It looked like fun. She effortlessly kept up with them on her hands despite the fact they were running with all their might. It was quite baffling actually. Unlike dark prisoners, C and B grade prisoners got to exercise every day. By right they should be more fit than she was. The young woman looked curiously at a slightly obese man at the back of the group. He lingered behind the group, finding it hard to keep up. The obese man seemed to feel something observing him. But when he locked eyes on the vacant gaze of the woman chasing after him on her hands, he felt as though his heart had been thrown into an ice bath. His throat constricted and his trouble breathing became even worse. The young woman tilted her head, her speed not slowing in the slightest. At that moment, her vacant expression twisted into a slanted smile. She looked as though she had never smiled a day in her life before. The facial muscles she should have been using only half worked, leaving her face somewhat crooked. She suddenly pushed off the ground, her hands landing on the obese man's shoulders. Her breasts dangled atop his head. But the scene that should have been one part erotic and another part comedic didn't feel like this for the obese man at all. "Help. Help me." Damien and Joseph looked back, only to hear a giggle that shook their very souls. The young woman slapped the chubby cheeks of the obese man, twisting into the air without letting go. At first, the obese man's body followed her momentum. But very soon it couldn't. The result was a head being ripped from its body, its voice being cut off halfway in favor of gurgling blood. The young woman landed on the ground, still pushing off her palms. But the obese man's head, as though a soccer ball rather than part of a human's corpse, danced on the soles of her feet, hopping from one to the other. Chapter 522. Damien and Joseph looked back in horror, their eyes widening in shock. What should have been a frail young woman suddenly became a monster in their eyes. There was nothing about her innocent expression that left them with any sort of ease any longer. The amount of torque you would need to twist a human's head off, let alone from such an odd position, was enough to make them shiver down to their cores. This young woman looked no different from any other in her early 20s. Yet, the strength she displayed was beyond the realms of reason. "Keep running?" Joseph barked. The young woman continued to observe the running group, her breathing hiccuping into a bubbling giggle every so often. It was as though she had overexerted her body, but her brain had yet to register the fact. It short-circuited, trying to decide whether she should prioritize laughing or breathing deeply. Damien and the others entered a state of high alert. It was at that moment that the guards began to flood out of the cracked walls one after another, some quickly catching up to some of the prisoners who hadn't spent their time escaping but rather on other matters. But it was then that the first arrows were released. It was so swift that it didn't even make a single sound beneath the chorus of excited roars and insane laughter. A guard who had just snapped the arm of a prisoner while twisting their limb back suddenly found a bloody hole between their brows. The prisoner blinked with curiosity, crimson splattering all over his face. His tongue whipped out, tagging the corner of his lip. He spit out the blood as soon as he tasted it, finding it not too pleasing. Then, without much thought, he snapped his arm back into place and continued running with everyone else, curiosity lighting his eyes. Despite the fact he had just seen a person die for the first time in his life, he didn't seem to feel any particularly special way about it. It was a complete slaughter. Every guard that stepped into the clearing was instantly sniped. The precision of the Hargrove City archers seemed to be even beyond the elite snipers of Earth. They acted as though in tacit agreement, not wasting a single arrow. Earth was very quickly finding out that there were some matters far more important than just talent. While the people of Earth were fighting to protect their home, the people of Terrain were fighting for their futures. Not just their own futures but that of their families and loved ones. Losing was not an option. Hundreds of prisoners made their way across the clearing, their confidence growing with each passing moment. The efficiency of the archers gave them this very confidence to the point where many began to smile. They finally saw an end to their nightmare. Of course, those smiling individuals weren't among the madmen designated with AS and DS across their chests. There were no small number of C and B grade prisoners who lost their lives at their hands. City Lord, is it really all right to let things continue like this? Every City Lord had a right-hand man. For City Lord White, it had been the secretary Naya. For City Lord Hargrove, it was an elder man who seemed even older than the skinny, graying City Lord. This older man, dressed quite like a butler, was known as Salnas. Hargrove continued to observe the situation, not answering immediately. In response, Salnus couldn't help but press again. There's clearly a reason why Earth decided to lock many of them away. Though they're clearly very powerful, they've all lost their minds. How can we expect to control them? They might end up being our downfall instead. Salnus finished, his tone somewhat somber. Though he spoke these words in order to ensure that his actions wouldn't dampen the morale of the men, he controlled his voice so that only the city lord could hear him. After all, every small advantage they could grab a hold of was a plus. They couldn't allow Earth the slightest chink in their armor. Salnus, I think it's best you don't ask for answers to questions you aren't qualified to have. The sudden indifferent voice caught Salnus off guard. He felt as though a blade was suddenly firmly pressed against his back, prepared to take his life at the slightest sign of impropriety. Salnus gulped, his frail old body shivering. Yes, young heir Anaret. I apologize, I've stepped out of line. Salnus struggled to speak through gritted teeth, the beating of his heart growing erratic. Even to now, he didn't dare to turn around to face Anaret, who had most definitely appeared behind him. He simply lowered his head, trying to stop the trembling of his body. When did this child grow so powerful? Salnus felt as though Anaret could take his life whenever he pleased. But, logically, this young heir who was nothing more than a little boy in Salnus' eyes should have still been several decades away from displaying such strength. However, when Salnus thought of a certain possibility, his trembling only became worse. Hargrove frowned slightly and swept a gaze back in Anared's direction. Something like reprimanding another subordinate was definitely crossing a line of respect. It was even worse that Anared had actually been listening in on what should have been a private conversation. In any other situation, this would have led to a battle of city lords. But even Hargrove seemed to feel some trepidation when facing Anared now. Just when Hargrove made the choice to swallow his pride and was about to try to alleviate the tension with some words, the ground quaked. Are they finally getting serious? Hargrove turned his frown toward Dark Cloud Prison. He knew well that Earth wouldn't leave this place unprotected. This prison was too much of a strategic point. In fact, even Terrain was aware of this, or else Anared would have never been sent here. The portions of the hexagonal prison that appeared above ground suddenly collapsed. No, they didn't collapse, rather they sunk into the ground, being swallowed beneath the concrete. Just after this happened, the hollow center that the prison once surrounded opened, separating like the jaws of a hidden beast. A platform slowly raised. At first, it was impossible to see anything atop of it. But very soon the shadows of men and women became clear. By the time the platform's gears grinded to a halt and appeared above ground, one could see a troop of over 10,000 warriors led by lead guard Garwin and Governor Duke Owen. Chapter 523. Joseph and Damien looked back after hearing the clicking of the gears. They had put their all into running and avoiding the and dark prisoners around them, but hearing such a loud commotion they couldn't help themselves. When they saw the sudden appearance of the Dark Cloud prison guards, and in such a large number at that, they felt as though their legs couldn't carry them fast enough. There was just half a kilometer between them and the city gates. To well-trained men like them, even before the metamorphosis, this was a matter of a 2 or 3 minute run at most. Yet, these few minutes felt like the longest they had experienced in their lifetimes. Escobar scanned the situation emotionlessly. It was as though he couldn't see the archers aiming their bows toward him. His gaze landed on each and every one of the guards that had fallen, the billowing of his mustache becoming deeper with each passing moment. Even with the long cycles of his breath, it felt as though the wind around the warden was kicking up, responding to his will in large swaths. Mow them down, he commanded coldly. At that moment the clicking of guns sounded. City Lord Hargrove's pupils constricted. That's impossible. Heavy military boots stepped forward before they each kneeled, pressing their rifles to their shoulders. And then the bullets rained. As quickly as the guards had fallen, the prisoners fell even faster. How could the fire rate of archers match the pace of semi-automatic weaponry? Shit. Damien growled, his feet stamping against the ground. A surge of earth followed his command, peeling concrete jetting into the air to cover his back. Don't panic. Those are normal gunpowder-based weapons. Joseph roared. Keep running. Using the cover Damien gave them, Joseph and the others crossed the final remaining distance to the city, anxiousness clear in their demeanors. Damn it. Open the gate. Joseph roared through gritted teeth, but the doors of the city remained firmly closed. By now, the crowd beneath the city gates was growing, and there were already more than 100 that had made it this far, while several thousand more were crossing the final distance. But those of Hargrove City didn't seem to hear what was going on below. Joseph's heart was gripped with despair. Could this really be a ploy by the Empire? No, that didn't make any sense. Just what was going on? Joseph no longer seemed to have the calm-headedness he once displayed. His decision-making became cloudy, and he banged on the gates just like all the others, unable to think for himself. He was practically brought to the point of tears, as though he could see his life flashing before his very eyes. Hargrove watched this scene from above silently. "It seems they understand their situation now," he said coldly. "Lower the platforms." Finally, the warriors of Hargrove City began to move. But they didn't open the gates as many would have expected them to. Rather, they began to lower platforms from the top of the walls. As a veteran of governance, Hargrove understood the truth of human nature, and it would be the truth no matter which world one was born in. If things came too easy, they wouldn't be appreciated. Very easily, a great boon could become bland, a life-saving grace could be expected, and a savior could become just a person doing as they should. When annexing such a large group of people, Hargrove needed them to understand who held the power and who didn't. As for the few who died in proving this point, who cared? Seeing the platforms descending, the group of prisoners that had been wailing below suddenly began to cheer. They didn't even consider the fact their lives would still be in danger, or that many more could have been saved had Hargrove chosen a different method. It was exactly as Hargrove expected. This was human nature. "Down," Escobar commanded coldly. "Shields at the ready. Charge." Governor Duke Owen didn't stay back. His aging body seemed even more agile than the youngsters, pouncing forward with vigor. He realized that platforms presented an opportunity. It was impossible for the thousands of prisoners that had escaped to successfully climb upon those platforms before they crossed the remaining distance. From a cursory calculation, there was only enough space for 100 people at a time, and it took half a minute for a round trip to be completed. Of course, Governor Duke Owen wasn't foolish enough to use these platforms to try and climb the city wall. That would be asking for death. However, the existence of the platforms would make breaching the gates much easier. City Lord Hargrove might have wanted to teach the prisoners a preemptive lesson with his actions, but he seemed to have not considered the fact that it would be impossible to use the archers to stop their siege if the very platforms they were using protected the warriors of Earth from above. Seeing such actions, though, Hargrove sneered. Dark Cloud Prison was a place with maybe the tightest security on Earth, with the exception of the Royal Palace. It could be said that in order to become a guard here, you had to be an elite amongst elites. Even those who weren't handpicked for this job from the very beginning had been high-ranking military officials before their placement. This was all to say that the group of men and women that followed Governor Duke Owen now were all powerful combatants. However, they were all powerful combatants without the slightest idea on how to siege a city. Both men looked toward one another as though they were looking at a fool. But only a real clash would tell just who was right and who was wrong. Unfortunately, whether or not that clash would happen would soon become an unknown. Bang. Bang, bang. Just when Governor Duke Owen had already crossed the halfway mark to Hargrove City, space solidified. Another swath of charging warriors froze, unable to move a single inch. This wasn't out of fear, no. They were physically unable to control their bodies. As though they had suddenly been placed into a hardened mold of concrete, everything from their limbs even to their facial muscles didn't seem capable of budging even the slightest. The central platform the guards and Warden Owen had just come from splintered into two. Slowly, a group of prisoners, each with bright red #D tags on their chests, made their way up. The air around them seemed heavy beyond compared to the point where even the archers on Hargrove City's walls couldn't budge an inch. At the head of these dark prisoners, a lanky man with messy, dirty blonde hair stood. His back was hunched and his arms were still crossed in his straitjacket. From the front, it was simply impossible to see his facial expressions because his gaze faced the ground, allowing his hair to block whatever view one might have had otherwise. His bare feet scraped along the ground, his legs barely raising as he walked forward. Yet even as this group began to move, no one else seemed capable of doing so. A cold sweat began to bead down City Lord Hargrove's forehead. Even he struggled to move, even twitching his fingers felt as though he was lifting several tons of weight. This ability, whatever it was the most powerful he had ever seen. No, even if he included those monsters he had heard of during his over a century worth of life, none could compare to this. Chapter 524. There seemed to be only 7 of them. No. 9. The number kept changing. It should have been simple to conclude that one of them had a cloning ability, but through this thickening wall of space, let alone moving, even senses didn't seem to work properly anymore. It felt as though one was trying to cast a net several kilometers away despite the fact the group was at most several hundred meters away. As if this wasn't fear-inducing enough, while a normal distance felt like forever to everyone else. To the group it was barely a short stroll. Though they seemed to be walking normally, they covered large distances as though they were sprinting with all their might. Not even a few seconds later, the group reached the vanguard of the dark cloud prison guards. It was only then Lionel's steps suddenly paused. In perfect unison, the group came to a pause with him. It was hard to tell what Lionel had promised these dark prisoners, and not even half an hour since their attempted escape began to make them treat him like this. But the reality was displayed before them all regardless. "I recognize you." Lionel's voice was quite striking in such a suddenly quiet environment. Unlike what one expected, it wasn't deep and gruff, nor did it have some evil air to it. Rather, it sounded like the normal voice of a teenage boy on the cusp of adulthood. Yet, one couldn't help but feel an instinctive fear toward it. It seemed to seep into their ears and host the beating of their hearts. As though a master plucking at their strings, he was a controller of their fate. "Aye, that's right. You were there the day they took me away from my mother." Lionel slowly walked toward Governor Duke Owen, his head still lowered to the ground. He painted quite an odd picture. Everything from his bare feet to his straitjacket seemed completely out of place. Escobar's gaze narrowed, his body still finding it difficult to move even the slightest bit. Despite the fact the boy's face was lowered and the prisoner tag that should have been across his chest was covered by a straitjacket, didn't stop the warden from recognizing Lionel immediately. He didn't say a word. Or rather, he couldn't say a word even if he wanted to. Even moving his lips was difficult. Despite the fact Earth was new to this new world order, Escobar was still aware that such an indomitable ability shouldn't possibly exist. All abilities should have limitations, weaknesses. Something like locking down the space within several hundred meters should have been absolutely impossible unless one was a higher dimensional being. However, what the Governor Duke didn't know was the fact there were indeed existences capable of such feats. And they were known as savants. Savants were existences capable of breaking the limiters of their abilities. Whether it be the issue of stamina, duration, or realm of influence, they didn't need to worry about any of this. This wasn't simply because they were able to rely on themselves, but rather because universal force naturally fueled their every action. Whereas those like Lionel or the Warden would have to comprehend universal cycles in order to use universal force. Savants had no need for such a thing. They could make use of the universe's strength as they pleased. The result of this were abilities that seemed more like the act of gods rather than mere mortals. And, in fact, on some worlds, these people were indeed known as gods. However, the price to pay for being a savant wasn't non-existent either. Much like how mortal savants of Earth were only good at one particular task, the same could be true of the savants of the dimensional verse. Outside of their abilities, the talents savants had were severely limited. Cultivating force, comprehending styles or universal cycles, even awakening lineage factors they might have been born with was all impossible. But, with such power, did they need such supplementary strengths? Lionel's hair shook somewhat. It seemed like he was shaking his head or lamenting something, or maybe he was thinking through something. He didn't have any care to give, just silently standing there as though the world would wait upon his every whim. "Where is my mother?" Finally, Lionel settled down on these words. But the cold sweat of Escobar's back only grew despite the stoicism of his face. In the moments Lionel remained silent, he could feel the struggle of the youth before him. Lionel's every instinct screamed to kill him, yet, as though he was internally speaking to himself in attempts to calm down, he remained silent. In the end, Lionel decided that he wanted to know about his mother more than he wanted to kill this warden before him. "Vice, it seems the man can't speak, release him," Lionel said slowly. Within the group, a man who looked about 27 or 28 years old picked at his nose. Snot ran down his face, but he didn't seem to mind in the slightest. This man was none other than Vice, the wielder of the ability so many here feared so much. Vice flicked a booger toward Escobar. Only then did the warden almost collapse, finally able to move under the normal laws of physics. "Speak," Lionel said plainly, his voice still as even as it always was. "Where is my mother? What did you do to her?" Escobar coughed, feeling as though he could finally breathe normally. He pulled himself up to stand straight and tall. When he stood to his full height, He was still quite a bit shorter than Lionel despite the fact the latter had his head lowered and his back hunched. But Escobar's momentum didn't seem to dampen in the slightest due to this. Escobar's palm flipped over, causing a spear to appear. In that moment, his momentum completely changed as wild energies began to flow around him. Harsh winter winds, fragrant spring air, blazing summer heat, cool fall breezes. Beneath this presence, the pressure the other guards felt alleviated by more than 80%. Though their movements were still somewhat hindered, it most definitely wasn't as exaggerated as it had been before. In the distance, Hargrove's pupils constricted into pinholes. Impossible. Hold. Escobar's voice boomed when the other guards wanted to take action. He looked toward Lionel seriously, the latter having seemingly not reacted to the sudden change. Your mother is dead. What do you plan to do with this information? Chapter 525. Lionel didn't say a thing for a long while. He continued to look at the ground, his arms strapped around his body beneath his straitjacket. For a moment, it seemed as though he hadn't heard a single word that was spoken. However, a bloodthirsty aura was slowly forming around him. Lionel's head tilted upward. Through the strands of his hair, one could finally just barely make out one of his eyes. It was a vacant pale green that seemed to stare at nothing and everything at the same time. The faint illusion of blood-red wings spread to Lionel's back, the distorted image of a demon hanging around him. In just a few moments, those red wings formed into the image of a female angel. Her red wings wrapped around Lionel, her arms holding onto him tightly. It was just an illusion, but it seemed oh so real. Tears of blood began to uncontrollably fall from the eyes of those around Lionel. With the exception of Escobar, they all seemed to be affected by the change. I see. Since she's dead, what reason do you have to keep living? Under the astonished gazes of many, thousands of dark cloud prison guards suddenly turned their weapons onto themselves. Bang! The sounds of several gunshots rang at once. But, from afar, it sounded like just a single gun had been fired. The actions were so smooth and in sync that even the pulling of so many triggers seemed to come from a single point. Escobar's gaze widened before gaining a tinge of red. In that moment, just as Lionel's words descended, he suddenly felt an overwhelming will to spear his skull through. If he hadn't bit his tongue, he really might have gone through with it. His heart trembled. Just what kind of maddening ability was this? The bloody angel hanging around Lionel only seemed to grow more corporeal as though being fed by the deaths of those around her. Her visage became clearer, a doting expression on her face as she lightly stroked Lionel's hair. No matter how one looked at her, it seemed like she was a proud mother. Or rather, she would have been had it not been for the fact her eye sockets were filled with nothing but an endless void. The sound of collapsing bodies filled the quiet air. In an instant, over half of a 10,000-man army fell into a pool of their own blood, their weapons painted with their own life. The scene was absolutely horrid and a metallic stench soon filled the air. Escobar's grip on his spear tightened. He could still see Lionel's singular eye through the strands of his hair, looking at him curiously as though he was wondering why it was he hadn't died when he told him to. As for the other, it seemed to stay hidden behind a veil of darkness, lurking. The Governor Duke could no longer hold back. He felt like this child had been wronged, so he gave him a chance and spoke the truth. However, he had never expected for his moment of soft-heartedness to cost him half of his men in a single breath. There was a limit to his understanding, to his sympathy. This was no longer the baby in those photos, this was a monster. A monster he had to kill. Die. Escobar's spear seemed to encompass the world. Its point became the origin and its shaft became purpose. In the blink of an eye, the spear tip appeared before Lionel's brow. With just a half a foot more, the skull of this young man would be pierced through. However, would things really be so easy? A mirror suddenly manifested before Lionel. Escobar's spear tip hardly touched its surface before it was reflected back. The warden was sent flying, his spear-wielding arms splintering in two. The horrid imagery of a forearm being split in half down its length etched itself into the hearts of all those who saw it. Within Lionel's group, a young woman with disheveled hair bit at her fingernails to the point they bled. But even then she didn't seem intent on stopping. She looked toward Escobar warily as though she was the one who should fear him rather than the other way around. It was as though she was completely oblivious to how powerful she was. Lionel stood in place indifferently. It was as though he couldn't tell that his life had been on the line. Or maybe, it hadn't ever truly been. Escobar's face became a deathly pale. He looked toward his arm incredulously, unable to believe what had just happened. He hadn't awakened a powerful ability. In fact, it was of the mere sea grade upon awakening. However, he had never cared much because his spear arts could more than make up for this. With the time he had spent with Lionel's father, it was doubtful that there was anyone on earth who could match his comprehension of the spear. So, how had he suffered so greatly just now? It was at that moment that there was a sudden change to the battlefield. Lionel and Aina led a charge out of the forest edge that surrounded Dark Cloud Prison. It had taken them several hours, but they had finally cleared out all the scouts and carved a path here. And luckily they had managed to avoid any casualties, in huge thanks to Lionel's leadership abilities. However, what they saw after they reached the clearing of flat lands astounded them. A city fallen from the skies, a group of prisoners frozen in their attempt to climb its walls, and over 5,000 dead guards, lying in a pool of their own blood. The sight was horrid, but what left Lionel the most stunned was the appearance of a particular man. Despite the distance of over 200 kilometers that separated them, with Lionel's senses, Escobar might as well have been inches from his face. Coach. Lionel's expression flickered with confusion. What was Coach Owen doing here? No matter how long passed, Lionel would never mistake that rat of a mustache for anyone else. Seeing the state of Coach Owen's arm, Lionel's anger suddenly flared. If there were two people he had to pick as the duo he respected the most in his life, the first would be his father, and the second would be this man right before him. In that moment, the battlefield suddenly gained a second bloodthirsty aura, one that seemed to rival Lionel's without the slightest hint of losing out. However, it was then that something completely unexpected happened. Lionel looked toward the new arrivals with curiosity. But when his gaze landed on Lionel, he was shocked. You look exactly like me." Lionel's head finally raised all the way, both of his eyes and his face finally becoming clear. However, when Lionel saw this face, his brows furrowed. This wasn't because Lionel looked like him, but because of the exact opposite. They quite honestly looked nothing alike. What the hell was this person talking about? You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.